Mr. Feely is a co-author of 2 refereed publications. So I'm really excited to welcome Mark in to give his presentation on dietary needs of pollinators and other beneficial insects. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you for the introduction, Pennington. And yes, we are Penn State. And while we're at it, go Hogs. So my presentation title is Dietary Needs of Pollinators and Other Beneficial Insects. I became interested in pollinators courtesy of our local beekeeper, who introduced me to the director of Penn State Center for Pollinator Research back around 2015 or 2014. That introduction led to Ernst Seed's involvement with a pollinator dietary study where we collected the anthers off flowers of native plants and sent them down to Penn State, where they extracted the pollen and they could look at the pollen from a dietary perspective for bees. So that's going to play a role later in this presentation. In June, I believe it's the 3rd through the 6th, Penn State Center for Pollinator Research is holding a symposium. On the 3rd, there will be a one-day session that is put on by the Xerces Society. If you have an interest in really getting a deeper understanding of bees than what you can get in 1 hour, and pollinators more broadly, please consider enrolling at that or attending that program. There will be a longer conference, and I think you might enjoy that too. That'll continue on, I believe it's the 4th through the 6th. So our objectives here are to understand insect pollination is accomplished by both bee and non-bee species, that native bees do not have identical windows of activity, and to increase the understanding of the dietary needs of juvenile and adult bees, butterflies, and other beneficial insects, and to increase understanding of the plants that support bees, butterflies, and beneficial insects. So who does our cold weather pollination? Well, turns out it's flies. Flies are important when temperatures are cold, elevation is high, or latitude is high. So in early spring, when you see something like golden alexanders and coltsfoot in bloom, you take a look at who's out there pollinating, it's flies. If you go up into higher elevations in the mountains, again, it's going to be flies. And my tutor on my pollinator education has said at high latitudes, in Greenland and such, you'll see a lot of fly activity there. Are all orders of bees active throughout the growing season? No. If you look at this particular image here, you'll see in pink a species Osmia, or an order Osmia, and it's basically its activity is done by the 1st of June, or 1st of July rather. And a similar case is there for Adrena. And then there's other species that are really just coming on later in the season. Melisodes, who I'll show you a photograph of later, doesn't become very active until we're into the middle of June there. Here's just a different presentation. Look how your populations are huge of Osmia early in the year, and then they just drop off by the time we're hitting July. So again, different bees are active at different periods. Some are active very early in the season. Some are active throughout most of the season, and some are active mainly from the heart of summer into fall. So what do adult bees eat? Well, nectar is their main source of carbohydrates. Most bees are nectar generalists, and it doesn't matter if the host plant is native. What do bee larvae eat? Primary source of carbohydrates is nectar. Pollen is the source of protein, lipids, vitamins, and some carbohydrates. Each bee species feeds its larvae pollen with a specific ratio of proteins to lipids, proteins to fats. It's best if that pollen source is a native species. The protein to lipid ratio of pollen varies by plant species, and what is fed to the larvae of bees varies by the bee species. There are few plants that perfectly align their protein to lipid content with a particular bee species. Again, few flowers have the correct protein to lipid ratios for a given bee. Bees compensate for this by visiting a combination of species. If the lipid levels are too high, it can be toxic to bees. If you look at this chart, you'll see some diamond shapes, and that particular those diamonds represent 3 different bee species. If you look at the circles, that represents the circles represent individual species. And what you'll see is that certain bees have a higher protein to lipid ratio that they want. Other bees have a lower one. And again, we're not seeing when and I should say we've got plant families there. We're not seeing a perfect alignment. We have some things that are close, but not perfectly aligned. Here you see another presentation, same sort of data. And again, there's a certain level of protein, certain level of fat that each insect is seeking, and there's a certain level of that each bee is seeking, certain level each flower has. Wild senna hebecarpa, has pollen that is only accessible to bumblebees, and not surprisingly, the protein to lipid ratios of this species pollen is nearly the exact ratio needed by bumblebee larvae. Is a plant equally attractive to a bee throughout the day? No. If you look here, what you're seeing is that there's a lot of time spent on a particular species there, which is Ohio spiderwort early in the day. And as the day goes on, less time spent on that. And in contrast, we look over at New England aster. They're not spending much time on it in the morning. They're spending a lot later in the day. We look up at the top, that's Culver's root, and they're spending a lot of time on it during the day. And that's your total visitations, I should say, is heavy on the one. Okay, so we go over here to the individual time spent. And again, the amount of time a bee is spending on a given species is varying by time of day. But you'll notice the New England aster, more time spent on it later in the day rather than first thing in the morning. A little bit of trivia here. Few North American native plant species rely on one or a small set of pollinators. Another little piece of information: small native bees are moved long distances by wind. So we don't necessarily have to have a continuous corridor of flowers to support bee populations. What you need is meaningful volumes of habitat for them to have. And they can move from one to the other by getting blown by wind. If a fertile female's blown, she can set up a new population in this new location. By the way, do y'all see the smiley face on the back of that bee? You notice that little smiley face, that happens to be a cuckoo bee, and that particular species is distinguished or characterized in part by that smiley face on the back. So, are all flower species equally attractive to bees? Well, the example of Senna hebecarpa, wild senna, tells us that pollen is not equally accessible. And why is that? Well, bumblebee pollen is only accessible, or sorry, Senna hebecarpa pollen is only accessible if by a bumblebee, because the bumblebee has to buzz that floral structure and then the pollen gets released. Other bees can't do that, so that pollen's only accessible to the bumblebee. In other cases, bee size and tongue length determine which species pollen and nectar are available. Okay, Let's look at some individual bees now. This is the bicolor striped sweat bee. It's about 10 to 11 millimeters long, nest in the ground. We often think of bees in hives, maybe in trees, but this one's nesting in the ground. In fact, many bee species nest in the ground. It forages on many plant families with short floral structures, and it's not attracted to human sweat. One of the neat things here is, going back to its nest for a moment, is that it nests in aggregations where multiple females will use the same entrance. This is a pure gold green sweat bee, 8 millimeters long. These are tiny. If you were to look at these with the naked eye, you can't see the beauty of this creature because they're just so tiny. 8 millimeters long, nest in dead or rotting wood. It forages on many plant families and occasionally lands on people to lick the sweat. Common bumblebee, 9 to 15 millimeter long workers, 17 to 20 millimeter long queens. It nests underground and forages on many plant families. The ligated furrow bee, it is 7 to 10 millimeters long. It's ground nesting in sandy, loamy soils, often in large colonies. You'll notice I'm talking about a lot being ground nesters. When you look down at the ground, there'll just be these little holes that aren't even the diameter of a pencil that they're going in and out of. This species forages on many flower species, and it licks human sweat. This is the armored resin bee. It's 7 to 9 millimeters long, and it nests in pre-existing wood cavities. It forages on the aster family. This is a leafcutter bee, 7 to 25 millimeters long. It nests in hollow plant stems and abandoned beetle tunnels. Some species of this genus forage on many species, while others specialize on asters and legumes. This is the longhorn bee, Melisodes. She's the one that doesn't really show up to the pollinator party until mid-June to 1st of July, and then she's active up until around the 1st of October. If you look at that flower, do you notice next to her front foot and second foot back, you can see where her feet have stepped and dropped the pollen on that flower. And by the way, you'll notice there's little segments to her antenna. And the number of segments to the antenna will tell you whether it's a male or a female. I believe the females have 11 segments, the males have 10. This is going back to the cuckoo bee. It's 9 to 14 millimeters long. It lays its eggs in brood cells of Melisodes. Its larvae kill the host egg or larvae and then eat the provisions. And it forages on many plant families. Should you only plant flowers that bees frequently visit? Well, the answer to that is no. Here's a bumblebee leaving its pharmacy. This flower, as many of you know, is turtlehead, Chelone glabra. A study at Dartmouth University found that Chelone glabra has an alkaloid, catapult, that is used by bumblebees to get rid of mites. Here's another little piece of trivia. Butterflies move pollen less efficiently than bees, but they move it over greater distances. Also, butterflies smell with their antennae and mouths, but taste with their feet. So what do butterflies eat? Well, caterpillars eat leaf tissues of specific host plants, and adults primarily consume nectar. So here we're looking at the American lady butterfly, and her host plants are everlasting, both the Gamashata and the Pseudonephthalium. She also consumes, lays her eggs on aster family members and milkweed family members. Then we come to the spicebush swallowtail butterfly. And the caterpillar hosts include spicebush and sassafras. And the adults are nectaring on carrots, milkweeds, asters, mints, and buttonbush. Of course, we're all familiar with monarch butterflies, whose caterpillar host are milkweeds. The adult host plants include milkweeds, asters, sunflowers, blazing stars, or gay feathers, bergamots, and goldenrods. Are all milkweed species equally good for monarch butterflies? No, not at a given location. They all have their value if they're native. But one of the things we see here in Pennsylvania is we grow at Ernst Seeds production fields of common milkweed, swamp milkweed, and butterfly milkweed. When you put these three species close together and then go out and look for chrysalis and caterpillars, we will predominantly see caterpillars and chrysalis on swamp milkweed. We will not see them on the other species in any great numbers. In contrast, at State College, Pennsylvania, where they put out plots of the three species side by side, they were devouring the leaves off of common milkweed, and they were basically leaving swamp milkweed and butterfly milkweed alone. So it depends where you're at as to which species are going to be important. And we don't, there's not a real good explanation for that at this point in time. Something was kind of interesting for me a year ago was that local photographers would come to our community, local photographers would bring high school students in to take their photos in our flower production fields. I met up with one of these photographers while they were doing a photo shoot, and the photo shoot was taking place at a field of swamp milkweed. Now, if you've never smelled swamp milkweed, the fragrance is similar to that of bubble gum. If you go past one of our production fields during the middle of the day, the scent is so strong you can smell it inside your car with your windows rolled up. However, if you go out very early in the morning or in the in the early evening, you'll notice that there's next to no fragrance. And what my pollinator tutor has shared with me is that plants are only put out the energy to disperse that fragrance. They only are giving off that scent when there are pollinators that are active that they will be pollinated by. So they don't want to waste the energy to not accomplish anything. I titled this presentation with a mention of beneficial insects. A lot of us look at wasp and we can often be of a viewpoint, oh my gosh, I don't want those in my landscape. Well, in the 27 years I've worked at Ernst Seeds, I've been stung 3 times. And one was in my front yard. One was at a swimming pool, and I think the other might have been in my front yard. And all of those stings were delivered by yellow jackets, not by other wasp. This particular wasp is the great golden digger wasp. When I see her in my front yard, she's not bothering me at all. I can get up near her, wave my arms around the flowers. She's not aggressive toward me. Her larval food is crickets and katydids. The adults forage on flower nectar. I personally observed them on mountain mints. And what's really neat is this. They'll nectar on mountain mints, then they'll go find the insects that they feed their babies. They'll sting it, and the sting paralyzes the crickets or katydids in this case. Then they haul it back to their nest in the ground. They'll lay an egg on the first one, and these insects that they've stung are paralyzed. They're not killed. They lay an egg on the first one, put that down the nest, and then they put additional insects in front of it. Then they seal that off. The egg hatches, it eats its way through these paralyzed insects and eventually comes out, and the cycle repeats. Kind of like the movie Alien. The enemy of my enemies, my friend. That's something I learned in graduate school from some of my international colleagues. The photo on the left is not Bicerides, but Bicerides is a wasp that kills the insect on the right, which is stink bugs. Now, there are native stink bugs and there are non-native stink bugs. Bicerides doesn't care if they're native or not. They will feed both to their babies. So if we attract this insect in, we help control our stink bug populations. Oops. Then we've got syrphid flies. These are cute little guys. They mimic yellow jackets, but they're tiny, really tiny. You'll see them. I was at my mom and dad's house back in 2015. I see these little itty bitty insects floating maybe 6 inches from my arm and occasionally landing on it. And their back end will kind of wave, and if you don't know what you're looking at, you think that maybe they're going to try to sting you. Well, this little fly, to raise its baby, it has to feed it 400 aphids. Well, I shouldn't say it feeds it. It lays its eggs on plants where there will be aphids. The eggs hatch, and they will consume the aphids. And apparently the maggots of this have the ability to pick up an aphid and suck the life out of the inside of that aphid. Just slurp it right out. And it takes 400 aphids to raise that maggot into an adult fly. The adults forage on nectar for energy and or pollen for proteins, lipids, and vitamins. How about let's go to flies now. Taconid flies are these really hairy flies. They're ugly looking. It looks like a house fly that's on steroids. Their larvae feed on the larvae of beetles, moths, sawflies, and stink bugs. And again, as you can see in the image, the adults are feeding on things like mountain mint. And so what are some good host plants for syrphid and taconid flies? Well, when we're looking at syrphid flies and taconid flies, heath aster, rattlesnake master, wild bergamot and its relatives, mountain mints, sumac, smooth sumac, goldenrods, and golden alexanders are very good. Now let's go a little further here and talk about tips for formulating mixes for pollinators. One of the key things we want is continuity of bloom from as early to as late in the season as possible. Early in the season in our landscape, we'll have trees and shrubs that are flowering. That gives ways to things, some of our early blooming trilliums and things like that. In Northwest Pennsylvania, we'll see golden alexander start blooming as early as about the 7th of April. Some years it's not blooming until about the 1st of May. And then from there, we want we want things in bloom the whole season with our herbaceous layer. But again, the early part, it's woodies. So in our landscape, when we design, we want woody species. We want overlap of blooms. We need continuity of bloom. We don't want spaces in there where there's nothing on the menu for bees. It's fascinating for me when I go to native meadows that there's, historic relic prairies. There we go. I will see continuity of bloom. Now, at any given date that I visit, there may be a greater or lesser quantity of bloom, but there's always something in bloom. You want 3 or more species in bloom in every season. Well, why is that? It's to have the diversity of floral structures and the diversity of diet for those bees. Next tip here, you want 5 or more plant families and 26 or more flowering species. Again, you're getting diversity of floral structure. You're getting that diversity of the pollen protein to lipid ratios. And if things don't exactly bloom when you might expect, usually there's going to be something known, something that will be in bloom in that window. So you're not going to have an empty period. The smaller the diversity of your seed mix, the greater risk you have that you don't have something in bloom at all times, because maybe a particular species is not fit at the site. So it's good to have that diversity to give you a greater hedge, to have a big hedge against having dead periods where there's nothing in bloom. And of course, you want host plants for specialist pollinators. So for monarchs, obviously, we want milkweeds. We're having our friends at Penn State are looking through to generate some information for us about what are the host plants for what insects use our native plants that Ernst produces as host plants for their larvae and that feed off them. So we're trying to get a better understanding of that. That's probably going to be about another year before that information's fully generated. And there's going to be more that we're learning as time goes along. This is partridge pea. If you've seen seed mixes I've designed, often I put partridge pea in it. And you might question, why should partridge pea be in there? One of the neat things about the anatomical structure of this species, and this is also true with wild senna, is they have extrafloral nectaries. Those extrafloral nectaries are putting out nectar even when the plant's not in bloom. Several years ago, I was visiting a site in West Virginia, and you could watch the honeybees going in and out of the foliage of partridge pea when there was no bloom on the partridge pea, but they would have been getting that nectar off the stems at that point. So by having that there, if there's nothing else blooming, you're still putting out nectar there. Another little piece of trivia I'll share with you is that I was speaking with our local beekeeper recently, and when he looked at, had an analysis of the honey that he produced done, they were finding some of the pollen of species that bloom early in the season mixed in with the honey that was collected much later in the season. So apparently there's a way, at least with honeybees, that they can go out and say, well, right now I can get lots of pollen off these, and later I can mix that with some of the nectar from these plants that are producing a lot of nectar but not much pollen. Because when you look at mints, for example, they don't produce much nectar. In contrast, in the spring, when you look at Ohio spiderwort, it produces, its only reward for bees is pollen. There is no nectar. And when you look at senna, the wild senna, there is no nectar in that floral structure. It's only pollen. That's the only reward for the bees going to it. Should your pollinator mix include grasses? The answer, yes. Oops. The reason to have grasses in that landscape is that rodents will burrow underneath clump grasses. And this, it should be specific here. We want clump grasses like little bluestem. Rodents will burrow underneath it, and then eventually bumblebees and such will colonize those burrows. Oops. Another little tip I've been given is, let's say that you had the option of that there's 30 species, 30 flowering species that would be appropriate for your particular landscape setting. If you have that many species to work with, there is value, and if your site is an acre or more, there's value into using two different seed mixes. Each of the seed mixes would have 10 species in common, but then they would have 10 species that are not in common. And you would plant those mixes perhaps in a patchwork quilt fashion of, say, a half acre to an acre of one mix and a corresponding amount of this other. Apparently, while there is value to native bees of heterogeneity, there's value to native bees of homogeneity within the area, but heterogeneity across the landscape. So it's good to have something a little bit different, not just the same mix spread across the whole site. The exact explanation for that, don't really know at this point, but that seems to be the case. Another tip, going back to when I was describing what the bee habitats are, where they nest, remember the dead wood. If we have old dead trees in the landscape, that's not necessarily a bad thing because that's habitat. Another little tip for you is that when you're formulating seed mixes, choose species that play well together. And so one of the tips I have there is to pair up short and or clump forming species with each other, and aggressive tall rhizomatous species with other aggressive tall rhizomatous species. And so where am I coming from on this? Well, if you put switchgrass out with gray goldenrod, switchgrass can go anywhere from 5.5 to 8 feet tall. If you've got flowers like gray goldenrod that are half a foot tall, and you have too much switchgrass in the mix, that will end up smothering out the shorter species. If you have aggressively rhizomatous species such as Canada goldenrod, they're going to overrun the clump formers. And so we want to be careful. And where we do use rhizomatous species with shorter ones, very low rates. So when I use common milkweed in a residential mix, I use only 1 ounce per acre because it's rhizomatous, whereas with butterfly milkweed, I use 0.4 of a pound per acre. A couple other considerations when we're designing, when we're creating landscapes for pollinators. If you're using seed to establish this landscape, you have to keep in mind, what is the slope? If you just try to plant straight wildflowers on a slope, you may not have the deep root system to hold the slope in place. Deer pressure becomes a big issue. There are species like Asterlavis that are absolutely deer candy, and they will devastate your population or decimate your population. If you have weeds such as mugwort or Canada thistle, and you in the perimeter of your landscape, quite likely there's dormant seeds of those species in the center of the landscape. And when you clear the site to prepare it to plant a native mix, some of those dormant seeds will come back to life or will germinate and will colonize the site. And you have to be prepared to control them. And if the population's high enough, you may need to have a seed mix that a selective herbicide can be used to keep it out, because otherwise it may turn to all thistle, all mugwort, something else. And I'm not trying to advocate the herbicides there. I'm just trying to explain a reality that I've seen some really bad situations. There's also, if you're trying to support specialist birds or pollinators, that's an important discussion to have. If you and I were talking, for example, if you wanted to support some of our songbirds, there's a lot of grassland birds that apparently the best habitat would be to have some pasture type species in one area and then meadow species in the other. And apparently what will happen is some of these grassland birds will nest in the pasture species in the spring, and they'll forage in the native meadows. And that's information coming out of the Smithsonian Institute, Conservation Biology Institute in Virginia. Okay, so I'd like to conclude the presentation part here by saying, You can support pollinators and beneficial insects by planting diverse meadows. So there were a bunch of questions there. What sort of questions did we have here?
Mark, if you'd like, I can sort of summate some of these questions
Yeah.
for you. So, a moment, I'll pull them up.
One of those is what is meaningful habitat? What size space does it have to be, and how many plants of a certain species or diversity are required for national habitat? All right. I don't have much land to work with. I live on a 5,000 square foot parcel, and I have children, and so I need play space. So my meadow that I have is all of about 200 square feet. In that little meadow, I've got about 14 species planted. Plant something. Doesn't matter how small, just plant. Because if everybody plants a little bit, you're doing something that's beneficial. Certainly larger is better than smaller, but do something. It's I don't want to say that there's anything wrong with doing something small. If a landscape, my aunt and uncle, the frontage of their house was only maybe 20 or 30 feet. They couldn't do a lot of landscaping there. And so that's a case where if they said, Mark, we want to do something, but we just don't have much land to work with, we'll put out a few mountain mint plants. They have a long bloom window. They support a great variety of pollinators. So again, on the small scale, just do something. Even if it's one plant, put out something. And if I had to do just one, it's going to be mountain mint. If you have access to do more, do more. Okay, hope that answered that question.
Yeah, and then we have another one. Top pollinator plants for bees and the top families for those plants. I think you mentioned some of it in the initial graph, but people asked for a recap.
So for bees across the board, it's different from some of the beneficial insects. With bees across the board, you've got such a long window in there that if I had to go to a narrow list, here's roughly what it is. It's spiderworts, so Tradescantias, Baptisias, Lespedeza, Pycnanthemums, asters, solidagos, monardas, Schimacrysta, which is partridge pea, senna, which is wild senna, that is the heart of my starting point of things. Now you can add to that, and if you want to see a more definitive list, if you go to the Ernst Seed website, look at our ERN-MX-153 mix, which is our Shoei Northeast native wildflower and grass mix. That has the greatest diversity of pollinator-friendly species in it that I can offer on large quantities. That's a good starting point. Now, for your area, you may say, well, this plant's not native here and I don't want to use it. That's fine, but that's a starting point for something that would be larger scale. If you're talking smaller scale, certainly there's some other things we have that are useful that can be added in. Okay.
And then, do you know how bees and other insects can identify the correct lipid to pollen ratio by the plants? Do you have, like, how do they read that information? How do they process that?
I believe that's in they're tasting that. There's something about how they're tasting it as they're collecting it.
And then you mentioned in the presentation human sweat. Is there any particular reason, ecological or evolutionary wise, or is it just sweat in general?
They're going to it for salt.
Okay.
Yeah, that was kind of an interesting thing to read. That it's a neat thing, and the book from which that information comes is in that information. I'm happy to share with you later there, because it's really good. It's really good stuff.
And then, do you have any correlation with soil nutrition or soil pH that and how it affects pollen production or nectar production?
I've heard some rumblings, but nothing that's so distinct at the moment that I have been working it into any presentations. It's not something I've command of at the moment. There's been discussions of that. That may be part of a study we interact with Penn State on at some point. But there is something there. I'm not sure how much. I'm not sure exactly what. There are some studies looking at climate impacts on floral nutrition. I think it still ends up being the case if we put diversity into our landscape, we'll support a good set of insects.
Cool. And one of the questions, do you have any data or research, or even if anecdotally, about possible negative or positive impacts of deer sprays or deer granulars on pollinators?
Uh, so we have to put repellent on a large portion of our wildflower acreage. We go around the edge of it, and what I'm aware of is I don't think that's adversely affected. Actually, no, I'm confident it's not adversely affecting the pollinators
Cool.
because we still see plenty of activity, and honeybees are doing their things in those fields. I don't walk into them and go, where are the bees at? And we don't run into an issue where once we start using these repellents, and we've used 3 different ones, we haven't found our yields collapsing, which they should if it's having an adverse effect on the pollinators.
Yep, that makes sense. And then, do you have any like specific size threshold for when you should be using seed versus a live plant? Like, is it
Oh, hey,
yeah,
that's a wonderful question there. And what we observe is that the patience for a seeding is inverse to the acreage.
what do you mean?
So what I mean by that is that if you had a 200 square foot meadow, you're probably going to use transplants because people get very impatient with that size. They can go out, buy geraniums, put them in, and know that they're going to have blooms same year. On the other hand, when it's 200 acres, they know that so transplants, last figures I had, and these are kind of a bit stale, you're going to run around say $1 for the plug, 50 cents to $1 per plug. By the time it's installed, you're somewhere between $1 and $2. So on a 200 square foot meadow, let's say you grow those yourself, it's not too difficult to grow that many plugs. It's not too difficult to install that many. You start doing 10,000 to 20,000 an acre.
Yeah.
Now you're into money that very wealthy people will not spend. It might be a very high-end landscape that's some sort of major facility, but you're not going to do that anywhere else. And so it's basically when your budget can't afford transplants that you go to seed.
Okay. So, also, there's of course a proprietary question asking what repellents you're using at Ernst. I don't know if you're okay to answer
So
that.
we've used pepper spray, hot pepper wax. We've also used waste whey and the solution they wash chicken eggs with. And
Very
those last 2 substances stink. You don't want to be in the area of that getting sprayed because it smells bad. But both of them all 3 products work pretty well. The capsaicin was pepper wax, just very expensive.
Yep. And does the capsaicin harm bees or insect pollinators in any way?
To my knowledge, no.
Okay.
And you have to
Cool.
remember, capsaicin's coming out of peppers, and I believe peppers are insect pollinated, so I don't think it's affecting them.
Cool.
And again, I should go back that when we use that, we didn't see any issues with yields.
Yep. That's good. So what do you feel like there's any impact of native bee pollinations from the non-native European and honeybees and things like that?
Actually, it's kind of a reverse. So if you put native bees in the landscape, or if you have native bees in the landscape, and most landscapes do, bumblebees in particular, they're big guys, and apparently they herd along the honeybees. And the Xerces Society has talked about how uh, they'll actually make honeybees more productive because they kind of bump into things, and the bumblebees don't like being bumped into, so they keep moving along, and they're actually more effective pollinators when the native bees are out there.
Oh, interesting. That's really
Yeah,
cool. Um, I think we've pretty much wrapped up questions. I know I don't know if anybody else has anything they want to add, or I know you have like a part two to your presentation. I don't know if that's
that was
something.
that was in what we showed there.
Yeah.
Now
Okay.
there
That's
was a question there: are there any insects known to kill spotted lanternfly, and
yeah.
what plants would attract them? I'm not aware of any that will at this point in time. I know there's an interest in that. I don't know that lanternflies have been. I think they haven't been here long enough to become for something to start eating them.
Yeah, to predate them. I also have a question here about if Ernst or you have any associations or relationships with any of the Midwest seed growers or somebody that you could recommend for the Midwest.
Oh, sure, sure. There's lots of good folks in the Midwest. You can look at. Let me get my thoughts. So, depending where you're at, companies like Ion Exchange, Starseed. If you're in the South, uh, to the west of us a little bit, Roundstone Seed. There's also oh, Hamilton Seed in Missouri, and then we go to there's Allendale, Iowa. I don't know if they'll sell on a small scale in that case. And there's few others. Depending where you're at, if you want, feel free to just drop me a line. Say, hey, do you know someone in this area, and I can get a name for you of a company and send that back to you. Our trade's very collegial. We have one of the nicest trades that are out there. Um, in the years I've been in it, when interacting with other seed companies, we very much get along and welcome each other into our facilities for tours.
Awesome. Cool. I don't think there's any other questions. Do you have anything else to add before we sort of wrap things up?
Oh, so somebody asked about the Smithsonian research and such. Again, send me an email on that, and I'll be happy to share my links of where things are coming out of there. Also, Center for Pollinator Research does a little newsletter thing that goes out. I think it's once a week, maybe once a month, but that's something that I could point you to as well if you remind me. Some real good things there.
Awesome. Well, I just want to thank you, Mark, so much for the presentation. I love the little tidbits and pieces of information we were all able to grab from that. For me personally, I'm really interested in the time of the day that insects were hanging out on what species plant, especially when we're talking about large, diverse meadow areas. So that was awesome. Thank you.
Something one final thing there. My pollinator tutor was explaining to me, if you watch an apple tree, you'll see that if the apple tree has what amounts to an east-west exposure, in the morning you'll see the bees working on one side of the tree, and as the day progresses, you'll see them moving to the other side. They're always on the side toward the sun. Was what he was claiming to me. So thought that was kind of neat. And indeed, in my own native landscape in my front yard, when we look in the morning, or sorry, when I get home from work, which is the main time I'm paying attention to the pollinators, I only see them on the west side of the landscape. I don't see them on the east.
Oh, interesting. So they're following the sun, possibly.
They're definitely following the sun on that. It's a neat thing. Now, earlier in the day, like when the sun's overhead, yeah, you'll see them all over the plants because the plants aren't all that tall that I have. But when it gets toward the as you're approaching sunset, they're on one side.
Very cool. That's awesome. Um, Well, again, thank you so much for the presentation and for being here and making yourself available to all of our attendees and everything in the future. Again, we'll provide Mark's contact information, and it's there on the screen for anybody that wants to reach out. Super helpful. And thank you all so much for being here. Thanks, Mark.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So, beech leaf disease. What is beech leaf disease? So, beech leaf disease impacts. Our main concern for us in the Northeast is the fact that it's impacting our native species, Fagus grandifolia, and how it's going to impact our forests moving forward on a large scale. I think we've seen similar incidents to emerald ash borer and Dutch elm disease, and other similar chestnut blight, things like that, that have changed the entire profile of our North American forests in a short period of time, 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So this is a concern. It's also a concern for non-native species. We've seen it attack the European sylvatica, the Asian orientalis, as well as there's Japanese versions that also, when this is introduced, is suffering from it. So beech leaf disease, which is referred to as BLD, was first identified in Ohio in 2012. And so that's where a lot of the initial research has taken place, and the data that they've been collecting is in Ohio, mainly by agricultural department and the forestry department. And pretty much what we've been able to conclude, and everybody can agree, is that BLD is associated with a specific nematode, which I'm not going to try to pronounce, but it's commonly referred to as LCM in all of the research and data that I've been reading. So I'll talk more about the nematode in a moment, but we'll get through to some of the symptoms. So I hope that not everyone is familiar with this, but if you are, great, you know what the deal is. The symptoms of the disease display as either interval darkening of the leaf called banding, or a deformation, darkening, and thickening of the leaf referred to as crinkling. These symptoms occur after bud break and don't change throughout the season. So that means that this is a static stasis for the plant after bud break, and it doesn't decline through a single season, and it doesn't change through a single season. It emerges, then gets these deformations, and then they hold true for the rest of the season. So this is what the symptoms look like. You can see the banding on the left-hand side. The easiest thing to do for the banding is you can notice it when you're looking at the lights. You're holding a leaf up to the light, and you can see that these darkening lines and intervanal darkening. The crinkling is shown on the right-hand side, and it looks similar to a couple other beech diseases, which I'll bring up and show you guys evidence of. But for the most part, it is thickening, darkening, and also associated with the banding. So this is some data that was come out of Ohio in some of the first trials. This is you can see on the left-hand side, it's a 2019 leaf, and then from the same tree in 2020, and you can see the crinkling and the hardening that's taking place on those leaves. So it's very distinct and definitive. Here's some other diseases that are often accidentally diagnosed as being beech leaf disease. One of them being anthracnose, which is shown on the left, which has some spotting. It also exemplifies some chlorosis, but generally bacterial burnout and things like that, or fungal burnout in the brown spots that you'll see. Then there's the Erinium gall, which is sort of the darkened thickening of it, and also could be confused with veining because it happens intervanal. But again, there's a brown spots that are visible on the surface on the underside of the leaf, which is the fungus in the gall, which is causing the crinkling on the top surface. So that's just not to be confused. So I said I'd mention a little bit about LCM and what it means to have this pathogen and what the issue is. So as anybody that does IPM understands and knows, again, triangle, there's three components that need to take place with any disease to take place, and that's pathogen, host plant, and environment, and then of course the disease over time, or time over the disease. I have a microscopic photo of the LCM. Uh, and I want to talk a little bit about the research that I collected. So I read through a lot of um, photobiological journals and a lot of molecular biology papers and a lot of molecular biology studies, all on this disease specifically. And it was a little dense, and so I tried to boil it down. And generally, what I have found out is that LCM nematode is present in all symptomatic trees. LCM is also present on non-symptomatic trees, but the trees that are showing symptoms also have a specific bacteria called Wolbachia present with the LCM, and those trees are suffering from beech leaf disease. So um, nobody's clear on how these things move or are associated together. Most often they're going to be moved around by a mite or an insect of some sort. And the Wolbachia is a bacteria that's probably living within the gut of another biome or insect or something like that. It's moving from like site to site, so possibly a mite or a different nematode. The thing about Wolbachia is that when it's present with the LCM nematode, it increases the LCM's ability and fitness to reproduce and move, and it's sort of like a steroid for the LCM in its microscopic level. And that's what's causing it to replicate more quickly, or it's hypothesized that it does. Again, nothing is definitive. There's also two other bacteria. There's two other bacteria that are present with the BLD. And one of them is they're Pseudomonas and Erwinia. And these bacteria are also present, but it's unsure whether or not they're causing the having a supplemental or third causal effect to the situation. They actually might just be present because the plant is already distressed, and these bacteria then can thrive on a distressed plant. That's unclear right now. But Erwinia is connected directly to fire blight in apple trees and things like that. So, and then there's also a couple of fungi that were showing up in symptomatic BLD samples. And one of the fungi specifically is known for having cytotoxic compounds and plant pathogens and mycoparasites being associated with that fungi. So as dense as the papers that I was reading were, this is also very dense, and I apologize. The takeaway is that there's a nematode called LCM, and it is actually a subspecies of the LC nematode, and the LC nematode exists in Japan and Asia, and then in the United States with the Wolbachia bacteria present, they think they've created a subspecies which we now refer to as LCM, and that's sort of how the association is going. Currently, there's nothing confirmed in chemical trials, but they're all ongoing. There's a lot of pesticide information out there, and there's a lot of options, but none of them are specifically labeled as a nematicide for trees. Avermectin is being used anecdotally in a couple situations in Ohio, and it's proving to be an effective nematicide, but again, it's not labeled for trees, so it's not proven and it's not recommended to use yet. But if you have that beautiful statuesque beech tree in your backyard and you're trying to save it, it might be worth this treatment. There are some anecdotal suggestions of pruning and keeping moisture levels on the leaves down by thinning and increasing light. And then there's also a lot of research out of Ohio right now recommending phosphite treatments, usually with a chemical called phosphite 30. And that seemed to be promising when they're done monthly from May to August. Again, it's anecdotal. There's no research to support it. Moving forward, keeping this in mind about beeches, they're amazing and they play a fantastic role in our woodlands and in our landscapes and our ecosystem overall. I think what we need to do as a community is plant for diversity and other long-term species in these woodlands. Not to shy away completely from beeches, but be mindful that they might not reach a mature age beyond 6 years. Most of the beech trees die more quickly than 6 years, but they're saying with more mature, larger species that they last about 6 years with some supplemental help from the phosphite treatments. Anecdotally, keep clean, remove the beech debris in a way that doesn't spread it or move it to other sites, keep it on site. and then supplemental phosphite treatments. Pretty much just wanted to make everybody aware that BLD is an issue. It's ongoing. There's a lot of research out there. You're probably not subscribing to Phytobiology Journal or Phytobotany Journal. So I took the extra time to read those articles and share with you all a couple of the citations. If you guys do want to read the articles or look at the data, I've listed here. I think Rutgers did one of the best briefs from their extension office, touching on everything. And then if you wanted to do a deeper dive, I really liked APS, which is American Phytobiological Society or Pathological Society. They had a good issue about this, or an article about that. All right, well, welcome back again to the Ecological Landscape Alliance Plant Conference, which we call the Plant Symposium, or the Ecological Plant Conference. This is our annual conference that's focused on native plants and plant nerds in general, and it's geared towards more the professional with a slightly higher level of learning and explanation of things. I'm excited to welcome Elliot Dumler. He is one of the leaders in the Midwest for native plants in general. He's the native plant perennial manager at Taylor Creek Restoration Nurseries, oversees all aspects related to Taylor Creek's perennial plug production. Elliot is passionate about all native plants, but has an obsession with the Carex genera. He focuses on exceeding client expectations in quality and customer service, as well as bringing more native plants into the horticultural trade. We love that. We're all about it. Elliot's educational background is that he received his degree from University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, where he majored in general resource management. Prior to Taylor Creek, he interned at Missouri Botanical Gardens, the Litzinger Road Ecology Center, and worked as a wilderness surveyor for the U.S. Forestry Service. Currently, he sits on the board of the Green Rock Audubon Society, all of which qualifies Elliot as a bona fide plant nerd. So welcome, Elliot, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate the opportunity to present today. Embarrassingly, I'm from the Midwest, and I did not know of your organization. And I did some digging. I'm like, wow, this is a great organization. So I saw a lot of names. I saw only a handful of names I recognize on the attendees. So that's good. You're not going to have to hear something that you've heard me blab about before. But today I'm going to talk to you about knowing your natives on a first name basis. And the idea is just, you guys are all plant nerds. You guys are professionals. You're going to know a lot of the plants I talk about. And so frequently I go to talks and I hear about plants that I grow and I know really, really well. But very often I've worked in the industry for 16 years, growing, propagating, and selling native plants. I still learn a lot hearing other people talk about plants. So my goal is that even though you guys are all really knowledgeable plant people, at least you can walk away with like hopefully one or two things that, you know, really make you understand the plant better and learn how to use it better. So, since I am not from the region you guys are in, I'll tell you a little bit about myself and our company. I'm the perennial manager for Taylor Creek Restoration Nurseries. We're a wholesale only operation that grows solely in plugs. We produce around 2 to 3 million plugs every year between 2 locations. We have around 2 acres of heated greenhouse space. We grow in eastern Kansas in the Kansas City area, and southern Wisconsin, just south of Madison, or about an hour and a half north of Chicago. Everything we grow is origin tracked. So you can come back and even on the flats that are delivered to you, you can tell the genetic origin of the plant. For example, if there's a Phlox divaricata or a Carex, you can look on the tray and you can tell what county and state the seed originally came from. So that's one of the things that makes us unique. We really got our start in the restoration industry where people were really concerned about genetics. I don't think I have to belabor this to the crowd I'm talking today, which is that people are sick and tired of this. You know, we as humans living on the planet are starting to realize that something like this provides almost no ecological value to the environment and to the home that we live in. There, rocks as mulch, little meatballs of plants are not exciting to the world and don't do much for it. People want to move away from the picture on the left, which is meatballs and mulch, to rich, diverse plantings. They want to provide ecosystems. They want to create habitat. They want to help increase infiltration, while at the same time still providing that genuine aesthetic beauty that looks good and makes the landscape around you more enjoyable to be in. I think all this hits really close to home for us, especially this year. It just seems, we've seen the highest fuel prices that I can ever remember in my lifetime. I'm 40 years old. We realize as inhabitants of this earth that things aren't trending in a good direction. You hear on the news all the time about flooding, glacial melt off, hurricanes, pollinator decline. You see all this focus on trying to improve pollinator habitat. And so we, as people, as decision makers, we want to do things that help. And to do that, we have to recreate ecosystems. We have to design based on a plant community. We want to mimic Mother Nature. You guys are obviously lucky enough to just hear Claudia talk this morning. Claudia is amazing, but Claudia and Thomas wrote the book, Planting in a Post-Wild World. If you don't own it, you should. So order it on, I'm guessing you can order it on Amazon, but get that. But this is just Claudia and Thomas's approach. Lots of people out there, many of you on the phone call, you're designing based on plant communities. Claudia and Thomas pitch it in a way that's easier for me to explain, which is, they have these groups of plants, filler plants, ground cover, seasonal theme, structural plants. But really the natives, and where I'm going to focus on today, are the filler and the ground cover plants. That's the way they design it. That's based on 50 to 60% of the plant material. So you need to really know these plants and design with them well if you're trying to create a plant community. Being from the Midwest, we have prairie everywhere. I've worked for the company for 17 years. I've been growing plants the whole time, and I've been collecting seed, and I'm lucky enough to get paid to go out and walk around the prairies, collect seed, see these sites. And while I don't know them as well as ecologists, I get to see a lot of stuff, and I use them as really strong reference point. And when you walk around a prairie and you look down, what do you see? The prairies are often known, when you ask about a short prairie species, people will say, well, butterfly milkweed or Asclepias tuberosa or Liatris aspera. The flowers are the ones that get all the attention. However, if you step down and you hone in and you look in, you can notice, like the plant on the left, Carex bushii, or the panicums. There are so many different panicums out in the prairies, not just the tall virgatum. They're a great resource for working in design plant communities. And then you go into the woodlands, and when you're going on walks or hikes, you walk through these woodlands, and they're beautiful. They have well-balanced ecosystems. Not all of them are perfect or flawless, but you see that plant material and how they interact with each other. You see the big leaf aster and the Carex pennsylvanica creating these large monocultures, and they outcompete each other for space, and they look good, and it's balanced. And understanding how these plants behave help you get that and replicate that as best you can in this disturbed in a built environment. So you need to know how your plants are behaved. I think many people on this call probably have a good understanding about that, but hopefully there are a few things I can point out that you haven't heard before. So especially on this ground cover and filler layer, you really need to understand, are your plants rhizomaceous or are they a clumper? Are they Carex pennsylvanica, like on the left, or are they prairie dropsy, which forms a mound and a clump on the right? And it's really important to know when you're designing on a plant community, what are structural plants? Because what you want to do is you want to create, with the plant community, the idea is to not have to put down hardwood mulch and not have to maintain this, to as minimal maintenance as possible. As we all know, zero maintenance is not a thing. You can't just neglect these things. However, you have to pick out plants that are going to cover the ground. I'm sure Claudia hit on this, but you don't want to use Amsonias and Baptisias as ground cover plants. They don't do that very well. This is a concept that actually Larry Wiener, I heard him talk recently, and he really hit home the generalists and specialists, which I think people in the horticultural industry know about this, but this is oftentimes where I often see horticulture and ecology just go on their separate paths. Well, they all have that same information and it's out there and it helps you pick plants and learn more about them. But I think many people on this call probably know about this. When you talk to people in the horticultural world, they don't know what the coefficient of conservatism is. So the coefficient of conservatism, or the C value, is an ecological value assigned to plants. And basically, this is when ecologists are out doing and surveying plots of land to see how good they are. Basically, the higher the C value, the rarer the plant is. So if you have something that's C0, it's either introduced or not a very unique species or in a unique habitat. A C value of 10, this is like that Circean pitcheri, which I got a picture taken with myself and a thistle. Not many, I'm into plants, sorry. But the higher the C value is, the rarer the plant is, the more adapted it is going to be for a really, really specific environment. Now, that C value can be a really good indicator whether that plant is a generalist or a specialist. However, in my opinion, it doesn't always align. You can find things that have a really high C value, but they actually perform more as a generalist. So I'm going to go into that, and I want to point these out on the plants I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to step into those right now. So the Antenaria species, these are, I am in love with them. I've been growing Antenaria for almost 10 years, and we do really well with it, and it's just such a great genre. In the Midwest here, we have Antenaria neglecta, Plantagenifolia, and Parlinii. These are generally considered generalists. They have a C value of 3, and they really fit the bill of like a conventional ground cover. They're kind of stoloniferous. They run over the surface of the ground, put down new roots, and they form a really nice thick mat that really fills in like what a non-native conventional ground cover grow. They'll form a dense patch. They can they work well with other taller structural plants. They do well part sun, full shades, and dry soils. The one thing that I got to point out, a couple cool facts about the plant, is they're dioecious. So they produce male and female flowers, and it's really easy to tell. I don't have a picture of it here today, but the Antenaria in that picture, you can see those are all female flowers. Once you know how to tell the difference, it's very easy. They're colonizers, so very frequently you won't see male and female flowers kind of on the same plant. You'll see them mixed around in larger groups within the planting of it. It's a host plant for the painted lady, so that's usually a really good selling point for people. You find these in both high quality woodland, high quality and low quality prairies and open woodlands. They do take quite a bit of disturbance, and they'll persist in sites that have been disturbed for years and years. But such a great plant, and the industry is really stepping up, and you can go to many different nurseries and find this plant available. Carex albicans, or white tinged sedge. This is a specialist. It doesn't have an extremely high C value. However, the plant is a little fussy. It's a nice clump forming sedge. It looks like it's a shade tolerant prairie dropseed. It'll form a nice 12-inch clump, and it forms in an 8 to 12-inch mound. Does well in part sun to full shade. If it's extremely heavy shade under maple trees, it doesn't tend to perform as well. Its sweet spot really is at part sun, open woodland site. The reason I say it's kind of a specialist is the fact that it is fussy with soils. It doesn't like heavy clay always, and you frequently find it in natural areas in higher quality woodlands. Carex and nectins, and I'm going to specifically point out the variety Xanthocarpa. So I get torn between getting really specific on these species. However, this is one where getting the variety Xanthocarpa is really important because it's much more drought adapted than just straight Carex annectans. Many nurseries don't differentiate that. However, I am seeing more and more getting more specific on breaking out plants like Carex annectans, Xanthocarpa. Also on like in the Rudbeckia genus, there's lots of subspecies of Rudbeckia fulgida. And that I like seeing where people are getting more specific because it helps you as decision makers make better choices. So Carex annectans, Xanthocarpa, this is a generalist. You find this all over the Midwest in low quality prairies, disturbed prairies, roadside ditches that are mowed and hayed. It's a pretty adaptable and resilient plant. It's a clump former. When it's in flower, it'll get up to 36 inches tall, but its clump generally sits around 2 feet. It'll form a nice mature clump. It around 24 inches wide. Does well in full sun to part shade. In the natural world, you rarely see this in shadier sites. However, I've seen it used in gardens many, many times where it's in a part shade. It tends to lay over, but I still think it has a really good appearance. Most people consider this sedge as a wetland species, but it does well in just average garden soils, with some organic matter. But naturally, you'll find it out in moist swales. And that's another thing. You might look at your questions here, but so frequently, even people that are landscape architects and designers just assume Caryxes are all wetland species, but there's lots of good upland species. Carex blanda, eastern woodland sedge. So all you ecologists on the phone or on this call, I'm gonna pick on you. These are ones you turn your nose at it. Look at that C value. It's a C value of 1. I even saw some references that gave it a C value of 0. So this thing persists in some of the most degraded sites. This plant, you find it, if you have a shadier spot in your backyard, odds are, and you kind of let it go, you're gonna find this plant come there. It's probably already there. But you can take that generalist attribute and get it to perform really well for you in a landscape. It's a clump former. It's not rhizomaceous. It gets about 12 inches tall. It has a coarser foliage and forms a nice mature clump. It does really well in part shade to part sun. And even as Claudia will say, it'll probably do well in a full sun prairie because you're planting taller plants around it that will provide the shade for it. And I'll show you an example of that in my next image. One thing I really like about this plant is it tolerates heavier compacted clay soils. A lot of the sedges, especially the woodland sedges, are really fussy with heavy clay soils. Because if you think about the natural environment that they're adapted to, they're used to having leaf litter and decaying organic matter and rotting logs and much better soils than oftentimes what we're seeing in built environments where there's compaction from construction and heat from concrete and heat islands. But this is a really, really great plant. Now, in areas where people use liriope heavily, more further south, liriope doesn't do well up north, but it's a really good plant that you can use in a mass planting as an alternate for liriope. And here it is. This is not a planting. This was just naturally out in a recreated prairie. However, the Carex wasn't planted there. It just came in on its own. But there you can see it's in full sun. This is in eastern Kansas. It is, if anyone's been to eastern Kansas in the summer, it's blazing hot. It's well over 100 degrees many, many, many days out of the summer. And here it is. You can see it growing amongst big blue stem. And this is late in the season. The only disadvantage I have to say about it is once it's really dry and in those full sun situations, the foliage yellows out. However, the benefit of that is once it starts to cool off in the fall, the plants green up and look really good and persist with green foliage well into the winter. Carex brevier or plains oval sedge. This is a nice, finer textured clump forming sedge. It'll get 12 to 18 inches tall, spread to 12 to 24 inches, does really well in full sun sites. So this is one of those species that you find Carex brevier in most all short grass prairies in full sun. It might not be a dense patch like you can see this plant in front of our office, but you'll find the plants there. It'll grow in sand prairies in full sun. It is drought tolerant. It does really well. It has a fine texture. It is generally considered a lower quality plant. So it's found in lower quality sites. So it has a C value of 3, and it's a generalist. So this is one that's pretty adapted to a lot of different sites, and it's pretty darn forgiving. There's something I want to address about it, which is one of the downfalls to it, depending on what your goal is for the site and how tolerant you are of an unkempt look. But post flower, it tends to lay over and lodge like it does here. This doesn't really bother us because that laying over foliage actually smothers any weed competition really, really well. And then later in the year, generally about September, it'll green up and you won't even notice that the plants had laid over like that late summer. But it's that post flower, late summer flop. Carex cherokeensis. So this is considered a relatively rare species. It has a C value of 7. And one thing I forgot to note early on the coefficient of conservatism, that value changes wherever you move around the US. So for example, if Carex cherokeensis, we found native stands of it near our nursery in Kansas, and it was the northernmost documented population. So it's going to have, ecologists will assign it has an assigned really a higher C value there because it's on the limit of its range. But if you go more into the sweet spot of in the center of its range, it's going to have a lower C value because it's a better growing condition. It's not always set to be found in those higher quality sites. This is a C value 7, but it's actually a pretty generalist species. It'll grow 12 to 18 inches tall. It's rhizomaceous or rhizominous, grows, spread 18 to 24 inches. Does well in full sun to full shade. Nice thing about this is a nice shade tolerant, moist sedge. And the other thing is the lower picture in the lower right-hand side of my slide, it's not very big and you can't see it well, but that's in January in St. Louis, Missouri. The plant was still very, very green. It's a great plant, but one thing you do need to be aware of is its hardiness doesn't go up into like Wisconsin. In the Midwest here, we can't grow it in Wisconsin. We have to grow this at our Kansas location. It isn't hardy up into zones 4, 5, 3. Carex eburnea. So this is a plant that is definitely a specialist. It's a C10 species. It is a really fussy plant, but it's a cool plant. And when you can put it in the right site and site it well and make it, get it in a site where it's happy, this plant performs really, really well. It is a dainty little diminutive species, but it has a lot of power in the right sites. It spreads, it gets 6 to 12 inches tall. 12 inches is stretching. I've rarely seen it that tall. And it'll spread into, large clumps. It is rhizominous. Does well in part shade to full shade and in dry sites. It has a really nice fine texture. One of the things that makes it a specialist is it really likes calcareous soils. And this is something that is new to me. I didn't realize this. I always thought it liked acidic soils. However, talking to other growers, ecologists, plant people, it's one that performs really well in calcareous soils. In the upper Midwest, it's found along Lake Michigan in the ridge and swale habitat that's created from the recession of Lake Michigan. And in the lower Midwest, you find this in glades, which are associated with limestone substrate. One thing about this, I got to throw in my production aspects. This plant has an 18-month crop cycle. When we sow the seed, we're actually not getting finished plugs off that seed till 18 months later. So if we sow in January of one year, we're not getting plants until basically May the following year. So be aware of that. This plant is not one you can last minute come in and request tens of thousands. Growers really need a lot of lead time on this plant, but there are a lot of growers that are very successful with this species. Carex grayi, another great plant for shady, moist sites. One of the reasons that I've always loved this plant is the structure of the seed head on this. It's just so unique and interesting. It's called burr sedge. And really the only way you're going to find why it's called burr sedge is if you clean the seeds and you're rubbing them between your hands without gloves on, quickly understand why it's called burr sedge. However, that isn't a problem. I don't believe in the built environment. People aren't going to, their dogs aren't going to get this stuck in their fur and get hurt. So I don't think it's anything to be too terribly concerned about, but it's a specialist. It has a C value of 7 in the built environment. It needs its specific set of environment. It likes shade and moist sites. You can push the limits on it. You can put it in average garden soils that may have built up organic matter from having hardwood mulch on them. But what I really like about it is when you put this plant in shade, it still remains upright. It doesn't lodge. So many species, if you don't get the sun shade tolerance right, they lay over if it's too shady. But this plant stays upright really, really nicely. In the natural environment, you're often finding these in floodplain woodlands. Carex grizzia, or woodgray sedge. This is a generalist. You find this everywhere in the Midwest in low quality degraded woodlands. This plant persists really well, frequently hand in hand with Carex blanda. Until you get to know your sedges really well by their seed heads, it's easy to mistake the two, but once you get more familiar with them, they definitely have a distinct difference. It's a clump former. It gets 10 to 16 inches tall and will spread 12 to 18 inches wide. It does well in part sun to full shade, grows well in dry upland soils. It also, like Carex blanda, is tolerant of clay soils, but also it does have that midsummer yellowing. Carex grizzia actually stays green almost throughout the entire winter, even better than Carex blanda. It's a really nice plant. It's very sturdy. You find these in mesic woodlands, degraded and even higher quality. Carex jamesi. This plant is a love-hate relationship with me. It is such a great plant. However, it is such a challenge to produce. This plant only produces 2 or 3 seeds per culm on the plant. As you can see the culms here, and one plant you might be lucky to get 100 seeds on that, and of course not all of them are going to be viable, so you have to really put a lot of time in to collect seed for this species. But Carex jamesi, this is generally considered a more conservative species. It has a C value of 5, but its performance in the landscape is more of a generalist. It's very adaptable and forgiving. This is a clump forming sedge. It's well behaved. It doesn't run on you. It's short. It gets max about 10 inches tall and forms a nice 6-inch clump, maybe a little bit bigger than that. And its sweet spot really is that part sun to full shade. You put it out in full sun, it's not going to like that much. It's really adaptable. It'll go from dry to moist sites. If you get this in the right site, it'll actually reseed to form a turf. But with all those good things, it is a plant that is a challenge in production, primarily because of the amount of seed that it produces. So we as growers, we have to really make sure we're able to collect that seed. It's a seed that is not commercially available on the market. You can't go out to other seed suppliers and just say, hey, I want to order 6 ounces of Carex jamesi. They'll probably laugh at you. Carex lupulina. This sedge is really closely related to Carex grayi that I talked about early. It has all those same attributes, does well in shady, moist sites. It's really sturdy, doesn't lay over when it's a really heavy shade site. However, one thing is we've seen that it performs even better in sunnier sites than Carex grayi. One advantage to this plant over Carex grayi is actually Carex grayi is a very, very challenging species. It's very inconsistent on germination. It's very slow. Sometimes it's really hard to get the seed. Carex lupulina is on the other end of the spectrum, is very, very reliable to produce, grow, crank out, ship. So if you If you're running into challenges getting Carex gray, Carex lupulina often is a great alternative for that you can find from growers. Does well, and you frequently find these in wet prairies or seasonal wetlands. Carex medii, or prairie sedge. This is one of my new pet sedges. I hope you guys can see from this picture the bluish colored foliage of this plant. It just jumps out to me. It is really, really cool. Very few of the native sedges in the Midwest, at least, have that bluish colored foliage. This is one of the prairie species. You find this out in full sun, dry prairies. And this thing is a specialist. However, it has some attributes that I think might make it more of a generalist in the landscape. There's not a lot of information out there on this plant being used in the landscape because it's not, the commercial availability of this is very, very limited. This is a plant we've just started being able to produce in numbers and put it out on our availability. So it has a C value of 10. This is only found in really, really high quality prairies. It's a short species. It's 12 to 18 inches tall, spreads 6 to 10 inches. It's rhizomaceous, but its rhizomes tend to run, it runs further than a lot of other plants. It's not a tight spreader. So that might be something that we learn about as we get more experience with the species. But while you find it in really dry sites, I've also put it in wetter sites, and moist sites, not wetland type sites, but swales that might collect water in the spring or during rain events. It performs pretty well in that. But what just really drew it to me is the fact that it's drought tolerant, it's rhizomatous, and grows in full sun. So this to me just seems like a plant we need to have more of. And so I've been honing in and really working on the production. In the upper right-hand corner, you can really see how that plant is throwing out rhizomes and spreads really nicely. Carex muhlenbergii, or sandbrack sedge. This is a plant that no one uses, and it's a species that grows in full sun, dry sites. I don't know why it's not used more. It has a fine texture. It's considered a generalist. It performs really well. It's adaptable. If you put it in moister site, it'll be okay. If you put it in a little more shade than sun, it does just fine. You frequently find this in the Midwest in bur oak savanna. So it likes that part sun or part shade site. Gets 12 to 24 inches tall, spreads 12 inches. And I really apologize. I don't have a great image of that. I have a new planting of it this year, so I hope to get some better images going forward with it. But like I said, you find it in savannas, also in hill prairies in the Midwest here. Carex pennsylvanica. I'm not going to dwell on this one. Most everyone here understands how cool Carex pennsylvanica is. It's a specialist, but it's not perfect in every site, but you can find a lot of sites that it'll work really well. And you can see it has a C value of 5, which kind of probably aligns with most people's experience with this plant. It's fine textured, it's rhizomatous, forms a nice dense mat once you get it established in the right site. But I do want to talk about genetics, because this is something we've learned over the past 5 to 10 years growing this plant. This is a species we grow primarily from tissue culture. We can grow it from seed. However, there's not enough seed out there to be collected, and very, very frequently the seed is not viable. So we had to turn over to growing it in tissue culture, and we gave the lab that we work with multiple labs on it. We gave them different genetics. And what we've seen is the inset picture on the lower left, the plug, these all were grown from tissue culture. They arrived at our nursery on the same day. They were all planted in these LP50 plugs. And the image on the left, that isn't a Pennsylvania genetic. Look, it's a small plant, has more of a bushier foliage. The one on the right, this is Carex pennsylvanica seed that we collected from a sunny, sandy hill prairie. It's much more drought tolerant, it grows faster, and it throws down rhizomes much faster than some of the Eastern genetics. So beware of that. Even if you're growing native plants and using them in your landscapes, understanding the genetics and where they come from, you can use that to your advantage. There, prairie dropseed is a great example. We see a lot of diversity. We grow many different genetics. We grow Missouri genetics, Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa. We see a lot of variance amongst just those genetics of prairie dropseed. I haven't put a direct correlation that, Southern Missouri stuff is always taller, but we do see that. We'll see some Missouri genetics be significantly taller than some of our Wisconsin and Iowa genetics. So just beware, there is genetic diversity amongst just the native plants that are wild type seed growing. Carex plantaginea. This is a great clump forming woodland deep shade tolerant plant. It has super, super wide or coarse leaves. It forms like a nice 12-inch clump. It's short, well behaved. In the wild, you find these in really high quality or rich woodlands. But this plant definitely is a specialist. It's really unique to that niche of heavy shade, lots of organic matter. It's not going to perform in a variety of different sites. One challenge with this species, though, is production. It's a really hard plant for us to grow. In fact, we grow so little of it, we don't even list it on our availability. I know other growers struggle with this plant. So while it's a great plant, it comes with baggage. And just be aware of that if you're running into projects, designing with it, using it, trying to source it. Carex praegracilis. This is a plant that I have to point out that in the Midwest and probably in the East Coast, it's been introduced from the West Coast. This plant has been introduced all over the United States through the movement, I believe, of hay and forage. So it is everywhere. We grow it because it's already been moved around everywhere. There isn't any listing because it's not technically native in the Midwest. It doesn't have a C value assigned, but it's a generalist. It is a rhizomatous species. It gets pretty tall. It'll get up to 36 inches tall with the flower on it. It spreads to pretty large colonies, 24 to 36 inches wide. Does well in full sun to part shade. The really unique thing about this plant is it's very, very salt tolerant. The image on the lower right-hand side, you can see it was planted as a green mulch around these tree planters. And this is in Lincoln, Nebraska. So, they're getting snow, they're getting a ton of salt in the winter on these plants, and they're very, very happy. It does, like a lot of the other full sun prairie species sedges, it lays over post flower, but I think it can actually work really well to your advantage. The image on here is a homeowner decided to convert their entire lawn to it in Kansas City, Missouri. Carex radiata and rosea, eastern star sedge. These are two different species. However, I lump them together because frequently they're found in the same habitats. They perform the same. They're very, very, very hard to differentiate unless you're a really good ecologist. You have to sit there with a hand lens and look at the styles on the flowers of the plant to differentiate them. Oftentimes you find them growing side by side in the same woodland. So it's like, oh, geez, you can't even just, eliminate one of them because they're not in this site. But it's a nice, fine textured clump forming plant. Has a C value of 5. So you find it in generally nicer woodlands, but it's pretty adaptable. I would consider it a generalist. It performs well on heavier soils, sandy soils, you name it. It's pretty adaptable to that. Its sweet spot really is that part shade. Heavier shade, it'll perform just fine. It just tends to lay down. No matter where you put it, with some of these finer textured sedges and woodlands, it tends to lay down with heavy rains late in the summer. But it really greens up great later in the year. Carex richardsoni. So this is my newest plant I'm trying to get out on the market. And we really fell on our face with it this year because we killed a bunch of them on accident. But this is a specialist. It has a C value of 10. However, the plant is very, very rhizomatous. It forms thick mats really nicely. It grows like Carex pennsylvanica. The neat thing about it, though, is it's tiny. It's a really diminutive species. I've never even seen it taller than 6 or 8 inches tall. There's no cultural information out there on the internet about it. Does really well in full sun to part shade. We collect the seed from this. The original collections came from a sunny, sandy hill prairie here in southern Wisconsin. So it does well in those dry soil sites. It really has a lot of promise. However, the market's not quite ready for it. We made a propagation mistake this year trying to build our numbers on it, and it's going to set us back a couple years. But we're almost ready to start to produce them in the thousands this year, but that'll be a couple years down the road. So if any of you are familiar with this plant or seen it, I would love to hear feedback on if you know of other people that grow it, because I really don't see this out in the market yet. Carex springelii, or longbeak sedge. This has a pretty high C value. However, the way I see it perform in the landscape is a generalist. This is a good plant to use in heavy clay soils if Carex pennsylvanica isn't working for you. Carex springelii is really adaptable to the soil type. It's a finer textured sedge. It really does get up to 24 inches tall, and it'll spread 12 to 24 inches wide. It is rhizomatous. It spreads more over the surface of soil versus below it, like some of the other species. Its sweet spot really is a part sun situation. You put it in too much sun, it really does yellow out. In the natural world, you find these in mesic open woodlands with loamy soils and lots of decaying organic matter. However, it's pretty darn adaptable in the built environment. Carex stricta. So generally, I haven't talked about very many wetland species. This is one that I've seen used really well in the Midwest. In the St. Louis area, it's the Whitmire Wildflower Garden. It's owned by the Missouri Botanical Gardens and managed partly by the Missouri Department of Conservation. If anyone knows Scott Woodbury, he just retired from there. He did a lot of great work on promoting the use of native plants in the landscape and collecting and doing research on what works and what works well and how to utilize them. And that's one he's really promoted for use in the landscape, because the Missouri genetics of this is much more aggressive than the eastern species. The stuff that you have out east actually forms nice hummocks and mounds, whereas the Midwestern genetics just run like wildfire. That's something you need to be aware of and be careful of if you're getting plants from vendors in the Midwest. However, he uses that to his advantage. When people in the St. Louis area or in the Midwest are planting stormwater basins and really want something to fill in so that they don't have to deal with weed pressure, this is a great plant to use for that. It is actually considered more of a unique species. You don't frequently find this in super degraded or disturbed sites, but in the landscape, it can be considered a general. So it'll thrive in moist sites, slightly drier sites. It's not super fussy on where you plant it. Carex swanea. I have to throw this sedge out there because it is a nice little clump forming sedge that no one uses. We actually had to remove it from production going into 2024 or 2023 because the plants we're growing them and throwing them away. And I have too many pets like that. Carex swanea is this nice clump forming sedge. It gets 12 to 24 inches tall, forms a nice 12 to 24 inch clump. Its sweet spot is really that part sun site, grows in average and moist soils, frequently found in dry open oak woodlands. Why more people don't use it, I don't know. It's a great plant. Yeah, you're like, how many sedges can he talk about? I will get some non-sedge species. So Carex texensis, or Catlin sedge. This is one, because of living in Kansas for 10 years, I started to dig into and worked with some of the local plant taxonomists to figure out what it was and really increase our production. It is a very short species that's tightly rhizomatous. So it gets about six inches tall. The seed stalks will stick up significantly taller at about 10 inches, but that basal foliage is really short, and it'll form a 12-inch clump pretty quickly. The challenge with this species is it's really particular to that part sun, part shade site. It doesn't do well in full sun and it doesn't do well in full shade. But it is in the natural world, you find these in dry sites. And it's also on the West Coast used as a great alternative for a turf. This image here is from St. Louis County Community College. We gave them a bunch of plants to trial as turf alternatives on their campus. And this is just an image of one of the plantings. They have pretty large plantings out in full sun, part sun, but the feedback we're getting from them is that part sun situation is really best for that plant. But when they get it to perform really well, it forms a nice thick mat and is performing like a monoculture turf. So on to some non-sedge species, Clinopodium, wild calumet. This is a specialist. Ecologists get worked up about this plant. It's really unique. It's cute. It's in the mint family. So it does spread a lot, but it's short. As most of us know in mints, they do a lot of their growth in the basal foliage early in the year and late in the year. So it'll form a nice thick mat of basal foliage, send up those flower stalks, do its seeding, do its business, and then kind of disappear later in the season. It works well in full sun, but it does, even though in the natural environment, we find it in drier sites, it seems to perform best in slightly moist soils. It is a species that's really tolerant of alkaline soils. You find it in high quality limestone glades and gravel prairies here in the Midwest. Dicanthelium. This is one of the panicums that isn't like the tall Panicum virgatum. The dicantheliums, I think, are very underutilized. There's not a lot of them out there on the native market. This is the one species that we're kind of honing in and growing on. It produces a really nice basal rosette that greens up really early in the year, stays green almost all winter long. And that basal rosette's great. It fills it, makes a nice green, almost ground cover type aspect to it. The seed stalks do sit up to 24 inches tall. It's a clump former. It'll get about 12 inches round. It does tend to reseed quite a bit in a garden. So keep that in mind. If it's a more designed planting, you want to keep it more kempt. However, we haven't seen issues with it moving around in our plantings. But it's a great cool season grower. So that really helps with weed competition early and late in the year. In the natural environment, you find it in prairies, savannas, open woodlands. Erigeron procellus, or robin's plantain. This is a specialist. It has a C value of 8. And in the landscape, it is pretty finicky. It doesn't like salt runoff. That'll kill it pretty quickly, which from what I've learned, it is rhizomatous. So it spreads and fills in to form nice patches, as you can see in this image. It does well in full sun to part shades, but its real sweet spot is that part sun, part shade. Does well in dry to medium soils. Wet is death to this plant. It does not like wet sites. But in the natural world, you find these in open woodlands and in a variety of soil types. Fragaria, or wild strawberry. This is a plant that I unexpectedly have seen a huge increase in the demand. We grow a lot of this plant. As anyone knows, strawberries run like crazy. It's aggressive. It's a strawberry. We all know how strawberries grow. I will touch, because I think most of these people on the call know about this, but in the Midwest, we have the non-native strawberry that I see so many people referring to. Oh yeah, I have wild strawberry in their yard. And you ask them, well, what's the flower color? They're like, oh, it's yellow. That is the non-native introduced one. The native Fragaria virginiana has a white flower. But it's a strawberry. We see people planting this as a ground cover in more naturalized plantings in amongst prairie dropseed and taller species. It doesn't behave well with other shorter species. However, it runs around and fills in nicely around taller species. If you walk around higher quality prairies in the Midwest, especially shortgrass prairies, this is everywhere around them, just creeping all around on the prairie floor. Hydrophyllum virginianum. This is a plant that It has a higher C value, so ecologists consider it more unique. However, my experience is that it's a generalist. It's really adaptable. It greens up early, stays green late, fills in, has nice basal growth, gets it really actually, I always thought it was a rhizomatous species, but it's not. It's actually a clump former. It spreads around by reseeding, but it fills in. It doesn't spread in a bad way in my experience. Someone will probably tell me I'm wrong, but that's what we've seen is it's not terribly aggressive. I wish it actually filled in a little more. But once you get it established, you have a nice dense mat. It really greens up nice and early in the spring. You frequently find it here in the Midwest in deciduous woodlands, degraded and higher quality. Kriegia biflora. So hopefully this is a plant quite a few people on this call have not heard about. This is a species really unique to higher quality sites. It's definitely a specialist. It has a C value of 9. Its basal growth is probably only 3 or 4 inches tall. It sends that flower stalk up 12 to 24 inches tall. What I really like it for is that basal growth. And you can see it in the background of this image. It's probably 3 or 4 inches tall. It greens up really early in the year, does its flowering, kind of sits dormant for a little while, and then greens up again in the fall. You often see it with frost on the leaves, and the foliage will turn a red and blue color. It's a really neat species. It does reseed within gaps, within plantings, but not in a bad way. The flowers do look like dandelions, so that might be an issue for some people, but it's a really unique plant, and I really like it. So I'm going to lump all the Pachyra species together. This is going to be Pachyra aurea, obovata, plantensis, paparicula. These are all, the Pachyras are kind of all behave in the same way. Some of them are aurea and obovata. Those are species that are more specialist. They have higher C values. Platensis and paparicula, those are more generalist. They have a lower C value. You find those in degraded sites along roads, right-of-ways, just overgrazed pastures. But you can use them all very similarly. Aurea and obovata are going to be your shade-tolerant woodland species. Platensis and paparicula, these are your prairie species that you can use out in full sun. But these guys, they're rhizomaceous and they reseed. So you have to use them with caution. My mother probably is still cursing me to this. Actually, I know she is. She still does curse me to this day for planting Pachyra paparicula in her planting. It grows amongst the pavers on her patio. But when you have in the right site, like in this lower image here, you can see it growing as a thick mat as a ground cover underneath common milkweed. And it really works. It's suppressing all the grasses that would normally be growing there. So just keep that in mind as you use these species. I know Pachyra aurea and obovata are commonly used all throughout, east of the Rockies. People in the Midwest, the East Coast love those species. We're seeing more and more of a demand of the full sun prairie species like Platensis and paparicula because they are more drought tolerant than and tolerate those full sun sites better than aurea and obovata. So with that said, as I always do, I talked a little faster and I'm done a few minutes early.
That's awesome. Thank you, Elliot. So I've gathered a bunch of questions here, so we have plenty of time to go through all those. So first off, what books, websites, etc. Do you recommend to dive into sedges specifically? Where do you nerd out?
Okay, so I'm in the Midwest, so I always like to, because I got to learn about how they are and they behave around the bulk of our project sites. IllinoisPlants.com, or it's Illinois Plants or IllinoisWildflowers.com, MissouriPlants.com. These are all really ecological centric sites. They don't focus on landscape. So you can really dig in on, the natural ecosystems and where they're at, host plants, that kind of stuff. And then Missouri Botanical Garden, because of the feedback that they got from Shaw Nature Reserve, is also a really good resource. I saw a mountain cuba thing pop up. There's those are just what come off the top of my head.
So, awesome. Thank you. I apologize. I'm like organizing questions as I ask. So, so basic technical startup question. When starting grass plugs, do you plant individual or multiple seeds in each cell or multi-cell nursery tray? Do you have good references? So I guess this is based on general nursery practice, whether you're doing multiple seeds per cell and then culling, or if you're doing single sheets and then culling and plugging out.
So we used to do most of them, and we call them, like in the industry, we call them open trays, 10-20 flats. That's how we would start all of our stuff, and you'd singulate seedlings out and put them in flats. We've moved more and more to direct sowing into 288 cell or higher count trays. The plants actually perform better, but always more than one seed. I mean, our goal is 5 to 10 seeds per cell. There's arguments on why not to do that, but that's how we do it.
Cool. That's awesome. Do you see Carex gracia? Is that also a clump forming Carex?
Yes, it is. Sorry, I know I
No.
forgot to mention that on the phone.
That's cool. And then some people are asking a lot about like mowing some of these turf replacement grasses, like the Pregracilis and some of the other ones. If you guys have seen that get mowed, or what's yours? Yeah.
Yeah. So that one image of the Pregracilis, that was actually in Kansas City, Missouri, and it was in an HOA, and the people actually complained in the HOA, which drove me nuts because it looked really well unkempt. But so they ended up mowing it once a year just to keep it shorter and looking nicer. Pregracilis or Texensis also tolerates a mowing. Brevier, the planting we have in front of our nursery, if we want to keep it from laying over, we'll buzz it off with a hedge trimmer, and it greens up. Nice. So a lot of them you can't do consistent mowings though.
Yeah, it just wears it down too much.
Yep.
So some questions about Antenaria species, if there's any like research on alleliopathy and things like that, or is it just so aggressive rhizomatously that it pushes everything out?
I don't know. It's not so aggressive that it'll push plants out. I don't know if you saw that image. The image I had, it actually has Pulsatilla patens, which is a really hard plant to grow, and they're cohabiting really nicely. It didn't run over that. It'll go around, like if you have prairie dropseed, it'll just go around the bases of those plants, and then the shade from the dropseed foliage will smother those. It's kind of a back and forth.
Cool. That's awesome. Some people asking about the sweetgrass, Hierocloa odorata.
Mm-hmm.
If you're making any attempts to collect seeds from plants that are strongly or specifically aromatic to enhance the sweet vanilla fragrance. I guess this person's asking because they've gotten plugs and stuff like that and noticed the grass doesn't produce the sweet aroma that it's known for.
So we don't. Again, we come from that ecological niche, and so we're just like, we're trying to get the species. But yeah, I could see, you're buying it for that, and it doesn't.
You get to scout all the plugs, and you're gonna rub each plant and be like, okay.
No, yeah. So no, we don't specifically go for that. So.
No, that's cool. And then some specific questions about like what will do well on a dry, sunny septic field in Massachusetts. Well, I think a lot of those will.
Yeah. I mean, many of those will. Just kind of, septics often have sand and subsoils. Carex brevier, Carex muhlenbergii, Carex blanda probably would do great in it.
And then for production wise, this is one of the last few questions is plantain sedge for production. Have you run into any specific issues with that?
It doesn't like being dividing timing is really critical on it, and it's really late in the year. If you can get enough seed, it'll germinate okay from seed, but getting enough seed is kind of a challenge for us, and I know for other growers. So that's kind of one of the big hurdles we run into.
Um, and then can you talk a little bit about any specific wildlife and pollinator values for the sedges specifically, or between them, if there's any specialists or anything like that?
I know there are out there. I know a lot of moth larvae feed on sedge foliage. Which specific ones? Um, I don't know. I'm sorry. I should
That's cool. No,
research it.
no, 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 no. It's you're like plant focused. No, it's totally cool. I think it's awesome that you had a great presentation that brought up a lot of these questions, and a lot of people are interested about it.
No, no,
And
that's great. And hopefully other people on there are lots of different moths I know that feed on them. I just don't know what they are.
yeah, and I know also like for the woodland stuff, because they keep moisture levels and a lot more organic duff towards the ground, then you're encouraging uh, fireflies and stuff like that, which aren't necessarily pollinators, so to speak, but it's definitely indicative of a healthy ecosystem. Um, I have a question. Do you guys do tissue culture or just seed propagation?
So we do like Carex pennsylvanica at this point, because of the volume we have to produce it via tissue culture. There's just
Yeah,
no way we could keep up with it through divisions and seed.
yeah,
There are a handful of other species, but 98%. We grow about. I reduced the list. I'm a plant nerd, so I was growing too many species that weren't really even selling. So we pulled off about 30 species this year. So I think we're at about 425 different species we produce. And I would say there's less than 10 that are tissue culture.
that's awesome. That's
And
really
like
cool.
one of
That's
those
great.
is like lady slipper orchid. That's
Yeah,
the only way to do it.
you're like, good luck doing that on your own. Yeah. No, this is awesome. This is a really fantastic presentation. I know a lot of people are jazzed to hear you speak about it. Sedge and Carex in general is fairly unknown, and not many people have the time to go out and ID them because, yeah, like you said, a loop on your hands and knees looking at bracts and stuff like that, or you time that 2 week window where you're looking at the keens or something. It's just very unlikely. So it's awesome to have someone like yourself come and share about all the different stuff you're growing.
Well, I
Thank
love to
you.
talk about it. I can talk, I'm in good company here.
Totally. So that's awesome. Thank you so much again for your presentation.
No problem. Yeah, I can hang around for a little while if there's any other questions that pop up.
Totally.
I don't know if there's.
Well, yeah, they want to know if you're still producing Carex Swanee Eye.
Yeah, so we do, and we're gonna have carryover for Swanee Eye. We produce a bunch this fall. I just am not growing a new crop in the spring. And there's Carex Mullen-Bergier, unfortunately, is another one that's just, it's such a great plant, but on the sales end, it's a dog.
I'm not gonna lie, I don't include it in a lot of our plantings because I'm like, nah, the site's not sandy enough. I don't have fast enough draining soil. It's not hot enough, and I'm always worried that it's not going to perform because of like humidity issues within a meadow system, because the soil might be like too rich and too hot, and it might cause it to fail. But
Okay.
you're like you're turning my opinion a little bit. I'm like, oh, maybe we
We'll
should
try
try
it.
it. Yeah,
I mean, we had one of the challenges we have is our soils that around our nursery are like pure sand, but then 20 miles away at my house, it's heavy clay. So I have them planted in a variety. In Mullen-Bergier does great in clay soils.
cool.
So FYI.
Yeah, no, I'm like totally. I'm signed up. Yeah.
Do it. Try some.
Yeah. What's your favorite Carex for a dry, shady environment?
Oh, there's so many. Carex albicans is near and dear to me because I spent countless hours collecting seed to get numbers of production for that. It's well behaved. There's a lot. Carex blanda I love that plant. I have it all over my yard in huge
Yeah.
plantings. It's like ecologically it's but it's a really adaptable, easy
Workhorse.
plant. Yeah.
Yeah, total workhorse. I know for me, I'll chime in too because I'm Rosia radiata, East Coast dry shade. It's like my go-to.
Yeah, and I know a lot of other people that love Rosea. In the Midwest, there's a lot of people that love Rosea radiata. It's a workhorse for people. It's you got your favorites.
Yeah, your faves. We all have our faves. Like I think one of the valuable things about your presentation is when we all get to nerd out about plants, we sort of get broken of our own favorites, and we're like, you see someone's enthusiasm and energy around a new species or a new plant and a different genera, you're like, oh, okay, I'm gonna try that now. So
yeah. There's plants that I've grown for a decade, and now I finally am like, I should try that. Oh wow, that's actually really good.
Yeah, totally. Um, Salt tolerant carex for house strip plantings native to the Northeast. I believe you mentioned.
So that's where there's a fine line on native non. Carex praegracillus has been introduced throughout the basically east of the Rockies. It's not native east of the Rockies, but it's everywhere now. But that if you really need something salt tolerant, and your customer or yourself are letting to bend the rules on nativeness, that's one that really performs well for salt tolerance. Well, it looks like someone pointed out Juncus effusius, is a salt tolerant species, which we've seen that in stormwater basins. It doesn't like dry though. We actually had in the Midwest, especially in Kansas in 2011, we had a really, really bad drought. And at a community college, they took a lot of that ARA money, so the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act. So they had shovel-ready projects, and they just packed hundreds of thousands of plugs in these stormwater basins and lots of Juncus, and they were looking awesome. And the 2011 drought just smoked them. It was very disappointing.
Yeah, that sucks. I know I'm always surprised by Juncus effusius because it is very facultative and it moves around really well. But again, it needs the taller prairie grasses and sedges to hold moisture at the ground level to keep it from really baking out and drying out. Because when it does,
I think if that soil is getting sun on it, it's just cooks the roots.
Totally. But I keep seeing it in upland systems, and I'm always like, oh yeah, this plant can do that.
Yeah, I mean, pushing the limits, and that's what. Claudia will always be an advocate. Don't just sit with that narrow focus and try them elsewhere. Just because ecologically they're found in a wetland doesn't mean they have to be there.
Totally.
But Isaiah chimed in there. What made me fall for sedges? Oh, what it really was is I was working in Kansas City and probably 15 years ago, and everyone just kept saying, well, that's not a place for natives. I'm like, well, you don't know your natives. And I am not a native snob, but people were like, well, blue zinger looks, it's just like they didn't know their native sedges. And honestly, the market, the diversity in the sedges out in the market, I realized, I'm like, gosh, no, there isn't a bunch of good sedges out there. So that's what made me just dig in. And my neighbor in Kansas for 7 years is a plant taxonomist. So that came in really handy. It's like, oh, here you go.
That's awesome. I'm actually curious about this too, because I don't like Dicanthelium's texture, but how are people using it in their plantings and design, and how do you guys recommend it?
So I don't see it getting utilized a lot yet in landscapes. I think it's more in naturalized plantings, where it's it's in amongst a bunch of other plants, so you're not really noticing it.
Cool.
Yeah, I was over at Intrinsic Perennial Gardens. He's a plant breeder in the Midwest here, and he's like, "Oh man, that thing goes everywhere. Here it is." But he likes it.
Yeah, seeding in. What do you think about Carex vulpinoide and Carex shortiana?
So I kind of excluded vulpinoidea because that's a Carex that's I feel like everyone knows about, but it's great. I mean, it's a tidy clump forming sedge, and it's again one you can, while it's found in wet sites, it's really adaptable to drier sites. We have them planted in sunny, sandy areas around our building that does great. Shortiana also one that my eyes have opened to that one. I always kind of we grow it, and I'm like, that's kind of a restoration species, but was visiting a botanical garden this fall and just seeing how they were utilizing it. I'm like, wow, it actually does have some landscape merit.
Yeah, totally. It's all about how you use it too.
Yeah, yeah, and I think a lot of people don't, they just plop a plant in there and not really aware of how it's gonna, Shorty is pretty aggressive, but you can use that to your advantage. I in the Midwest, I almost got chased out of a master gardener group talking about chasmanthium. I mean, they were like, I almost got tarred and feathered about that. But like, well, hey, you have a site that's tough. You can't get anything to grow on it. That's where you utilize some of these thugs.
And you actually see chasmanthium fail in large colonies on the East Coast. Everywhere I see it in large colonies, even in whether it's full sun, part shade, full shade, it gets these colonies that are very dense, and then it starts to thin itself.
Yeah, I think they rot out. I actually think
totally.
I mean, they need airflow around the plants, at least in container production. Like it really does.
Yeah,
like
I think
airflow.
Yeah.
Best rhizomaceous carrots for underplanting, full sun, lawn sized. Best, come on. There's lots of them out there. Pennsylvanica, Texensis. There's a lot. Prettiest, okay. I don't know. My definition of pretty, that's all. Sorry, Jennifer. Get the handout and look at it. There's lots of information there. Well, my time is up. Thank you, guys.
Awesome. Elliot, thank you again so much for coming in and sharing with us. I think it was awesome. Everyone really enjoyed it. And we look forward to meeting in the future.
See you guys.
All right, thanks. I am excited to present our next speaker. I had the pleasure of speaking with Brendan Shea the other day and had a great conversation with him, and really excited because of all the awesome projects that he's built and all the insights that he brings to the rooftop gardening industry. Just in the small sites that we were able to cross paths on, I was really excited by that. So it's my pleasure to welcome Brendan. Brendan is a certified green roof professional with 2 decades of design, build, and project management experience in the construction industry. In 2009, Brendan co-founded Recover Green Roofs, where he oversaw more than 100 green roofs, rooftop farms, and rooftop amenity spaces through design, construction, and the long-term maintenance. He serves as a green infrastructure advisor for Green and Open Somerville, where he helped the city of Somerville implement green space and green roof zoning requirements in 2019. His experience has led to numerous presentations for ASLA, AIA, Boston Society of Architecture, and more. Currently, he runs Roofterra, a green roof and building envelope consulting company based in Waterbury, Vermont. So it's my pleasure to welcome Brendan, and thank you for being with us.
My name's Brendan Shea. I think Penn did a great job introducing and giving some background, but in 2009, I started a green roof company with a good friend of mine with the goal of basically increasing green space by putting plants on buildings. But we kind of quickly evolved into a much larger company that was doing everything from craning and carpentry, metal fabrication, and hardscaping that was kind of required of us in order to work on the larger projects that we were more interested in. Next slide. So we're going to be going through the types of green roofs that exist, what the benefits of these systems are, and some kind of design considerations. I'm not going to get as detailed about plant types, but more so the systems that support a wide variety of plant types and what's possible on a green roof. Next slide. So green roofs really are a built system to intended to mimic nature. So a series of drainage layers are intended to kind of take what exists in nature and shrink it down into a much thinner profile. This kind of dimple board that we're seeing on the screen is a drainage and retention layer that's really probably one of the more critical aspects of a green roof. And I guess it's worth going through, but below soils, you've got a filter layer, a drainage layer, a protection layer, a root barrier, and then waterproofing. And all of these are really important because we want to both support plants, but also, and maybe even more importantly, we want to keep a building dry, because even the most beautiful green roof is eventually going to be dug up and pulled apart if the building is being damaged through water intrusion. Next slide. Now, green roofs come in generally, there's two distinctions of thinner, shallow soils that are called extensive green roofs and intensive green roofs, which are deeper soils, anywhere from 6 inches to 6 feet of soil. Semi-intensive roofs are often referring to something that's kind of right in the middle of that 4 to 6 inches, or maybe have a variety of different soil depths on the roof, putting more soil where there's load capacity under support columns or at the perimeter of a building. But just for the understanding of common terminology within the industry, is this extensive meaning thin and intensive meaning soil. I mean deep soil. Next slide. And these terms don't make a ton of sense in English, and that's because they're derived from the German definitions. Germany has really been the leader of the green roof industry over the last 50 years. And most of the technologies that are being used in traditional green roofs are coming from Europe and specifically Germany. So these terms are coming from the FLL guidelines, which it's always interesting to know what FLL stands for, because it's a very common acronym that's used. And I used to try and pronounce this Vorschlaggesellschaft, like it's word salad, but these are the 3 longest words that I think you could possibly link together. And yeah, just helpful understanding that where these terms come from, why they don't make much sense, but that's what we're stuck with at this point. So all the pictures I'm going to be showing today are from projects I've worked on, and we'll kind of get into some of the details of those. Next slide. Now, above these drainage and protection layers, we've got engineered media. It's never going to be just traditional loams or ground soils that are used. It's a highly engineered growing media. I use soil, growing media interchangeably, as most people do in the industry, but it's worth knowing that there's the occasional person that you come across that corrects you and says it's not soil, and you just have to nod. But the primary function of these engineered soils is drainage. They're meant to drain when we get 2 inches of rain in 30 minutes. This system needs to be able to shed excess water weight that it's not designed to hold. And so the green roof soils are a lot more aggregate heavy. They're much sandier. There's zero or very little clay content. They'll never, even if it's a bit moist, you can never ball it up and clump it together. It's very loose soil, and generally larger particulates kind of make their way to the surface over time. But its function is drainage, and that kind of in some ways supporting plants is not necessarily secondary, but is not the primary goal in the initial design of these soils. They're lightweight, and all weights for green roof medias are referred to by their saturated weight. So that fully wet soil weight is generally going to be between 75 and 95 pounds per cubic foot. And that variation is based on what we're growing in the soil, what the weight limitations are. So oftentimes the green roof isn't necessarily an afterthought, but the green roof design is being dictated by the structural loading allowances of the building. So we're kind of the last in the building process to be able to we're forced to work with what we're given in terms of weight generally. Next slide. So for extensive green roofs, what's most common is sedum. And that's following in the German model. Sedums are not native to here, but they're drought tolerant. They're able to outcompete weed species at times in the summer. That is until there are certain sedges and things that will take over and kind of outcompete sedums. And so with that, I think it's next slide. It's at times important to work with what I found that green roofs that are just sedum can really struggle over the long term to provide the aesthetic function that many clients want to see and aren't necessarily providing the environmental benefits that you would hope a large garden roof would be providing. So integrating with sedum, native flowers, native grasses, things that may take a little more water from a temporary irrigation system at planting, but also trying to shape client expectations that a roof is going to evolve over time and working with that, and that kind of educating clients that the evolution of a green roof is a good thing, and that a roof doesn't need to remain static. That being said, sedum still is the primary plant type that's used on green roofs that are the most common around the country. And these are going on, large commercial buildings, schools. The Ford manufacturing plant in Dearborn, Michigan is, I think, 5 acres of sedum and a small number of native wildflowers. This center project, or this center picture, is public school in New York, and it was planted with a mix of sedum plugs and perennial wildflowers. This image on the right is a community college in Western Mass that was really struggling with maintaining good sedum coverage, and so it was a cost-effective solution to make it more aesthetically pleasing and provide more environmental function, was just doing a large seeding of different wildflowers, and really allium, you can see, took over this particular year. But that's another example of a roof that's just evolving year to year. Next slide. So for those sedums, plugs and sedum mats are the most common here. Cuttings are used more often in Europe. Most of the projects that I'm working on these days are large commercial projects where we are implementing what a landscape architect has designed, and that landscape architect is working for the owner directly, and the green roof installer is working for the general contractor. So a lot of times we don't have the most open communication. And at times we're even discouraged from having direct communication with the designers, which is really unfortunate. But it's that working for two different bosses and following chain of command within the industry. And the side note. So, but plugs and mats are most common here. Plugs are going to take 1 to 2 years to take over a roof. This upper right image is from, I think, Natick High School in Massachusetts. And plugs are planted at, I think, like 3 plugs per square foot, which is pretty low, and isn't a great option because it's allowing a lot of weed and unwanted seed intrusion because of the lack of coverage. Whereas sedum mats, which you see on the right side, really allow for covering over all soils, and that the day one aesthetic that a lot of clients want. What we found is we can really do a lot by making green roofs more interesting by planting plugs and or bulbs into the soil and then rolling out mats. But yeah, these are the most common planting methods, and cuttings are more so used in Europe or as a maintenance to fill in areas, but are just less common in the bids that we see these days, or requests for proposals that designers are putting out. Next slide. But there's still a lot that can be done in thinner soil profiles. This house, or this is it's a gathering area for a house in upstate New York. It's an all moss and fern roof. I think the image on the left is probably not too long after planting, and you can see some of the fall colors. And then the image on the right is just from this past summer. And this is just an example of a really interesting project that can still create a lot of interest and utility, and is following what is possible with a 4-inch soil profile. And there's some soil retention to maintain soil on that slope, but yeah, it's thin soil and irrigation system that's turned on periodically, but this is an area that just gets a lot of rain, and so some of the mosses were purchased from a moss farm in Connecticut, and then some mosses were harvested from the site, and it's a mix of the two just to maintain or to not be pulling any too much moss from one particular area. But this is a site that has definitely evolves year to year based on the particular conditions of that season. Next slide. And thinking about a roof as an environment with a microclimate that is very different from that of the surrounding ground level plants and soils. I use this picture because this particular site had a lot of challenges of wind and reflectivity. And those are things that are really hard to predict prior to installation, especially if it's new construction. You may have no idea how the building that's being built is going to impact the immediate surrounding area. We had these kind of three large pixelated deep soil planter areas, but the perimeter of this hardscape gathering space was a 6-foot wide band of liriope and I think and bulb plantings. And the liriope in certain spots was getting fried by windows, and so you just have areas where nothing would live. And it's important to just remember that the roof is going to be hotter in the summer. It's going to be colder in the winter. It's going to be the first soil to freeze generally. And it's going to be the first area to dry out. So it's tough. It's at times native plantings can be challenging because an environment may be far more extreme than what's typical for a region. For green roofs are generally going to be, so we've got extensive and intensive, which is referring to the soil depth and the weight. And within the extensive, there's built in place green roofs. And then there's tray systems. The built in place systems that we're looking at here are basically large sheets of material that are going to be rolled out or laid out on the roof layer by layer by layer. These are generally more cost effective for large projects. When you're getting into the thousands or tens of thousands of square feet, this is a much more effective way of building. So you're rolling out layers, you're then placing the engineered media on top of these, then planting. Next slide. So green roof trays are generally 2 foot by 1 foot, little in 2 foot by 1 foot or 2 foot by 2 foot, 4 inches deep tray systems that each tray is pre-planted. This particular image in the top right example that you're seeing is from a company called Live Roof. And that particular system is what was used at this Quincy Middle School. On the right side is from a Boston Children's Museum, and that's not a project we did, but it's a tray system that has large walls and it creates a very visible grid on the roof. It's not aesthetically pleasing. It's not great for plants that are able to kind of move. It's and I think this is just a factor of that the green roof industry in our country is still very young and evolving, and what is being done now is not often these aren't best practices that are probably going to be followed in 20 years. And that it's both exciting to be part of an industry that's evolving quickly like that, but it's also at times really challenging because there's a lot of misinformation or lack of information amongst installers, designers, general contractors that has left a lot of green roofs that, you know, look like this one on the Children's Museum. That's just, you know, it looks okay, but if you look up close and when you're looking at it out a window, it doesn't look like it doesn't look like it doesn't look like a real planted environment at ground level. It looks like a bunch of trays. So, and next slide. Now, intensive roofs offer a lot more opportunity to mimic what's at ground level, but it's still going to require generally irrigation, at least for part of the season. And these projects we're looking at are going to have anywhere from where we've got trees here, we've got about 3 feet of soil mounded up. And these are the kinds of more people-centered projects, projects that are going to have, you know, I know grass lawns don't always get the best rap, but they're usable soft space, and they're, you know, they are at times, they don't have much environment, or they have zero environmental benefit, but they are good for people to be reading or playing with their kids on. And so trying to balance that. And for projects like this, the montage on the left, you know, we're installing what a landscape architect has designed. So that's a project where we're doing everything on that roof. And I realize it doesn't even look like a roof. It looks like the entrance to a building, but it's actually a courtyard that's surrounded by building on 4 sides. We're up on the 3rd floor here. And so it's a site that has a lot of access challenges. But when you're out there, it doesn't feel like you're on a roof. And there's everything from lawn areas to large mature trees. And it's a beautiful space, and it's comfortable for people. And this is in a really dense downtown environment that in Somerville, Massachusetts. And it, you know, I'm often torn between environmental function and what is appealing for people to recreate on. And ideally, there's not a pull between that. You can have both, but I think you're at times still making you're trying to thread the needle between the two, which is, I'm sure, challenging for a lot of designers. Irrigation is generally required because plants, even with 3 feet of soil, it's still not, roots aren't going down as deep as they would be at ground level. And just that soil profile is going to dry out more quickly than at grade level. Next slide. Generally, we refer to these as amenity roofs. You know, so these types of projects we're looking at have trees, grasses, bocce courts, outdoor kitchens, and they're serving a lot of people. And so they're challenging in that sense that you can have hundreds and hundreds of people who all treat one area like this as their own personal yard, which is both great, but also challenging. And so using plant species that can hold up to lots of visits from dogs, kids, and people kind of they treating this as their yard and kind of climbing all over. And so that's both challenging, but also great. Next slide. Now, meadow roofs are probably my favorite of all green roofs. These can be extensive or intensive. This particular system we're looking at Harvard Business School is about, I think it's about 20,000 square feet of roof area. And we're using a predominantly perlite based soil media. So it's a very, very lightweight media that has a lot of porosity, meaning there's a lot of void space in that soil profile. And it means it can hold a cubic foot of this soil holds more water than traditional green roof soils or ground level soils. And this system was planted with a mix of it's predominantly seed. It's a predominantly seed mix, and it's from a company called Omni Ecosystems we worked with, who they developed the soil mix and the seed mix. But their goal here is creating living soils, which is really different from a lot of other traditional green roof medias and soil science in general that's looking at NPK and maybe some micronutrients. But this system is starting with an inert perlite-based soil and then seeding with things like rye and clover and trying to build up a dense root profile and creating a system that's never going to need any fertilizer. This does have irrigation, which is really important because those soils are so light, and you want to make sure plants are able to are living through any kind of weather event. But this particular roof is 25,000 square feet. It was an existing roof, and projects like this, where we're working directly with the building owner, or the university, and not through a GC, are the kind of projects where we're able to generally do a lot more creative and outside the box, non-traditional projects. And so we'll get some close-ups of this roof, but this is everything from clover, which on other roofs is looked at as a weed, to echinacea and black-eyed Susans and red twig dogwoods. And so this roof is much lighter, with weighing anywhere from 15 to 25 pounds per square foot, which is really light considering the plant types that are thriving up there. Next slide. So here we see a little bit more of a close-up of this same roof. And you can see this picture on the bottom right. There you can see a little bit of the perlite, which is then capped with a bark mulch for that first year, more for a mix of aesthetics, just so we're not seeing any of that perlite, and also making sure it all stays down. And these kinds of roofs are great because they evolve every year, they evolve every season, and the expectations are that we're going to follow what Mother Nature dictates and not be trying to weed out clovers and sedges that is sometimes being pushed on other roofs. Next slide. Rooftop agriculture, much like meadow roofs, are more of a American innovation in the green roof industry. The Whole Foods roof uses a traditional mounded row planting style, which looks great and is more cost effective, but isn't as necessarily productive as some of the modular systems we've done, like at Fenway Park and Boston Medical Center. Next slide. Boston Medical, this was a really fun project. It was an existing roof. We had a lot of load limitations. And this roof it's small. It's only 7,000 square feet, but they're cramming in a lot of growing space. It's highly visible. The roof is used by a camp that is for kids who have parents who are in the facility long-term, and employees. Um, the There's a test and teaching kitchen at the hospital that works with patients that are as part of basically a wellness prescription. There is a teaching kitchen in which they're working with patients who are getting food from the roof, harvesting food from the roof, and then using that food in a kitchen and trying to address kind of lifestyle related health issues through non-medicine means. And kind of one of the more exciting things is this roof it's visible from a high-rise tower next door that is all patient, long-term patient stays. And so it provides a source of entertainment for a lot of the hospital, that there's just, there's beekeepers on this roof because there's a series of hives. The roof is in operation from April through November, and it's been a great addition to the hospital and a model for a lot of other hospitals around the country. Next slide. A similar system was used at Fenway Park, this modular system. And the reason we were using this kind of modular system for both of these projects is these were existing buildings where they had weight limitations based on snow loading in the winter. So every fall, this system, those individual containers, which are milk crates with a fabric liner in them, and so we're using a soil from Vermont Compost Company, and we're able to kind of pack up the farm into areas where there are load allowances, and then every spring it's reset up. It's efficient, it was cost effective, and it was using space that was otherwise just unutilized dead space. This particular project gets over 1 million visitors a year. And it's important for just reminding people that food is grown from soil, especially a lot of people who are visiting these farms, just that most food that they're eating is probably just coming from a grocery store. Right, next slide. I don't want to spend too much time with the benefits of green roofs, but I think it's worth acknowledging that, what the benefits are and how they can differ from roof to roof. Next slide. So green roofs they retain stormwater, meaning they hold it, and they detain stormwater, meaning they delay it. So the difference between retention and detention is retention is holding it permanently and then sending it back into the air, and then detention is just slowing how quickly it comes off the roof. And that's important, next slide, because most water that's running off a roof in a city like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, these older cities that have combined sewer systems, meaning water coming off the roof and off the sidewalk and off the street, meets with the same pipes that come from your toilet and your house and your dishwasher and your shower. So they have a combined sewer system, and those systems are generally meant to operate on a volume of water moving through them that is less than, for a city like Boston or New York, when we get 3/4 of an inch of rain or more, these systems are overwhelmed. And so most of the systems aren't meant to take more than 1/2 inch to 1 inch of rain in a 24-hour period. So a green roof is retaining, meaning some of that water will never enter the sewer system, or at least delaying it. Typically, a green roof is going to be shedding water 3 days after a saturation event. So it's just slowing the amount of water entering the system over a longer period and allowing that built infrastructure to absorb it. Next slide. In Boston, we have about a lot of the outflow points for that combined sewage have been closed, but there's still dozens of places where when it rains more than 3/4 of an inch, sewage is released into Boston Harbor, the Charles River, the Mystic River, and that's bad for people, that's bad for the environment. And this is common to a lot of older cities, but even in not older cities, the cities that have separated sewage systems from stormwater and a building sewage, that stormwater is still a very polluting and unhealthy wastewater coming out of the into those waterways. And by reducing and delaying, we're allowing our infrastructure to catch up. Most FLL designed green roofs are designed around 1-inch rain events and how much water a green roof will capture when it rains 1 inch in 24 hours. And so that tends to be the baseline design goal of a simple green roof, is 1 inch of rain capture in 24 hours through soil, through retention cups below soil. Next slide. The other real environmental benefit of green roofs is keeping buildings cooler. Next slide. The more densely paved and hardscaped an area is, the hotter it's going to be. Adding green roofs is going to, next slide, keep the temperature of the roof a lot cooler. This temperature analysis slide, it's the blue line. These big swings are showing the temperature of the black waterproofing membrane, and the red line is the temperature swings of the roof below a green roof. And so that is keeping ideally a whole neighborhood cooler, not just the building. Next slide. But keeping a building cooler and that surrounding community cooler is also an economic benefit. Next slide. The other economic benefits are going to be, reducing the frequency in which a roof is replaced. But it's really stormwater management and cooling of the building are the two primary, both environmental and economic benefits. Next slide. At times, what's somewhat overlooked is the benefit that it brings users and the real estate growth from that. This particular project was just interesting because they had a really clear, some apartment units had a green roof and some didn't, and being able to compare what the value increase was from units that had a green roof, what the cost of that green roof was. And these are helpful in just promoting to developers and basically people who are just looking at the bottom lines of whether or not it makes sense to install a green roof. Next slide. The shape of a building is also really, the shape of a building is really important in how benefits are how the green roof benefits the building, and that basically a large a building with a large footprint that isn't very high. So the roof to buildings, it's a better way to put this. Basically, a skyscraper with a small roof is going to see a lot less benefit in cooling than, let's say, a big box store or a place like the Javits Center. So this is a 200,000 square foot roof. So this is a more than 4-acre roof, and it's a 2-story building. And if you compare that to a 20-story building that has a half-acre roof. So this building was an easy economic, the ROI on the green roof was really quick because of that large roof footprint in comparison to the internal size of the building. Next slide. And that keeping that roof cooler is really what is protecting the waterproofing. Waterproofing typically breaks down from sun exposure and temperature swings. And so when a roof is getting up to 140 degrees during a sunny summer day, and then it gets to 80 degrees at night. And that 60-degree temperature swing up and down every day is what breaks down waterproofing more quickly than under the protection of a green roof. Next slide. So talking about that waterproofing, typically it's going to be either a monolithic, meaning a fluid applied membrane, or a heat welded membrane, a single ply. It's never going to be shingles or the black rubber roofs that have glued seams. Typically, we're going to have a roof that's welded seams, like a PVC or a TPO, something that is going to be able to last a long time, not break down from potential root intrusion or just breakdown of chemicals. So I just bring this up because it's important. We regularly are told that green roofs are a stupid effing idea because a lot of traditional building contractors just see it as another way for water to enter a building, which is the last thing any builder wants. So it's really important to address those fears and not just come at this from a horticultural perspective, because you're potentially turning off a large part of individuals that are important to get it, that are important to get buy-in from to ensure that the industry grows and individual projects succeed. Next slide. There's a lot of options for testing roofs. There are electronic tests that can be done on waterproofing before a green roof is installed, or even after a green roof is installed. So this guy walking around with ski poles here he's testing a green roof for leaks, and that's done with this. It's called an EFVM, electrofield vector mapping test, and basically it's just they're sending a small low voltage current through a layer below the green roof, and then he is out there with basically a voltmeter, and he's walking around the roof looking for any place that he can find any kind of electric current running on, that his voltmeter is picking up. Again, just bring this up because it's important to address with people at times that you can test for leaks before you put down a roof. You can test for leaks after you put down a green roof. Next slide. That similarly, large waterproofing companies are now incorporating the green roof into their warranty package. And this doesn't address most, individual homeowners or small businesses. But for a place like this project, this is a UMass roof. And for most, institutional buildings are going to have a 20 to 40-year warranty on their roof. And having the green roof as part of that warranty package is really important for large corporate and institutional clients. Next slide. Similarly, drainage, after waterproofing, the proper functioning and a proper draining roof is really critical to keeping a building dry. Roofers will often say a hole in a roof is not a leak unless water is allowed to go in that hole. And so when water is allowed to build up on a roof, or a column of water that builds up on a roof is going to exert a lot of pressure. So something that may not cause a leak when there's just water flowing over it versus a small pinprick in a roof that has 2 inches of standing water on it is going to cause a lot different of a reaction within, or a lot different volume of water entering the building. So protecting drains is really important. Next slide. Here, this Harvard Business School project, you can see a drain, and that drain is surrounded by gravel so that we're trying to keep plant matter away from the drain, both in terms of its roots and actual just vegetation growing over it. So we've got a stone vegetation-free area, and then we've also got a metal box called a drain inspection chamber that's keeping the drain accessible as part of regular maintenance by the staff people they're doing the horticulture check, but they're also doing drain checks. Similarly, next slide. We also want to be maintaining a vegetation-free zone at the perimeters, or HVAC equipment or skylights, anywhere that there's flashing of a building, you want to keep plants away from. And so that's both for the maintenance that may need to be done to those flashing areas, to roots from growing up and into the flashing, as well as just creating maintenance pathways for the green roof maintenance staff, but also all the other maintenance staff that are going to be on a roof like this, where, you know, you're going to have HVAC people up there. You're going to have electricians up there at times, people doing exterior maintenance of the building, all the random people that ideally aren't trampling on your plants. Next slide. At times, drains are going to be located below hardscape areas, and making sure that those are accessible, that they can be inspected, but also that they're functioning properly, so that water is able to drain from planted areas below hardscape areas and into the drain. And so essentially, we want the green roof, or we want the roof system to drain as if there was nothing on it once our soil profile hits that saturated point. Next slide. Similarly, you know, where we've got curbing separating hardscape from soil, we want water that is from, you know, let's say the irrigation system, once it saturates that soil, and granted, I realize the irrigation system should not be fully saturating soil and we should not have excess runoff from our irrigation system, but nonetheless, once water has saturated that soil, it should be flowing down to and below the drainage layer, and then able to flow along the surface of the roof. And it can go in any direction as if unimpeded, as if there was no green roof up there. So in this particular project, we want curbing to we want water to drain below curbing. Next slide. This is a project where this is SUNY Cobleskill actually, and this is what Penn and I had talked about. This project incorporated some hills that ideally the hill would just be all soil, and you get greater soil depth and more plant diversity from that. But this, you know, weight limitation, so this particular project instead used geofoam to create basically a hill. And next slide. And what we want is we want water to drain off the actual geofoam, but also below the geofoam. And again, so allowing water to move freely along the roof as if there was nothing up there. This photo also shows how some of the ways soil is brought to the roof in a built-in place system. So we've got, you know, our layers going down. You can see that drain board on top of the geofoam hill, and then we've got filter fabric going down, and soil is being pumped up onto the roof via a blower truck. So these blower trucks work like concrete trucks. They can go up 20 stories. They're really useful in moving large amounts of soil cost effectively. Generally, you're able to move about 100 yards of soil with a truck a day, depending on how far you're going. Next slide. So that soil conveyance, most typically, you know, again, these are large projects where we're moving hundreds, if not thousands of yards of material for one project. So on the left side, they've actually got 2 super sacks. And this was done at night because that was the only time we could close a street to get the crane needed to go up. This is working on the 21st floor of a building on the left side. And so we're craning 2 1.5 yard super sacks at a time. And basically those sacks are hoisted, and then soil's released out the bottom of them, either a bag that's cut open or has a little snorkel that you're able to just pull a string and let it drop out. On the right side, This is up on the 13th floor of a building in downtown Boston where soil's being pumped up 13 stories, but equally impressively about 400 or 500 feet horizontally. So a lot of setup for projects like that. Next slide. Here we've just got more super sacks. You can see swinging it in the air. And yep, and this is Sam, who's, what's great about this is you can see Kennedy, the gentleman in the back, is actually, he's directing the crane, and Sam there on the left is just going to be the one dropping soil. And it's low manpower on certain sites like this, in a good way, in that it doesn't take a lot of people to move a lot of soil. Next slide. Here we're pumping soil from we've got a slinger truck that's shooting soil into a blower truck that's then shooting it or pumping it up 13 stories to these gentlemen you see pumping it out. Next slide. Here we've got, I figured while we're talking conveyance, I think these are generally the most interesting parts. Dot, if you want to click on the image on the left where we've got 3-inch I think 2.5, 3-inch caliper trees that are being rigged up and flown onto the roof. So a lot of the projects we've been looking at are large commercial projects that are really stimulating from a design and installation standpoint, but aren't as stimulating from an environmental standpoint or for why I got into this in the first place. So bringing, what my favorite projects are these meadow roofs, natural projects, either creating unique spaces for individuals to enjoy or community at large to enjoy, but more projects that really feel like a natural place and not a park that is built up and heavily maintained, and these roofs that evolve naturally. And that is why I got into this, and also why I decided to, after 11 years, leave a large construction company, is because this is really where I want to be working and where I find the most personal fulfillment is these kinds of very projects where I have a lot more ability to install what I think is the best fit and not working as a cog within a large construction machine necessarily. And next slide. And the kind of the inspiration for Recover was I had been doing a lot of work for this gentleman on the Cape, repairing the particular composting toilet that he had at his house. And I was working at a composting toilet company, and I didn't know it for many years, but he was an author and illustrator, and his work revolved around recovering the earth and reevaluating how we assess the built environment and incorporating plants into more spaces, and not being that the construction industry shouldn't just be basically paving and hardscaping all of the built environment, and that figuring out how to incorporate living systems into our built environment. And so, yeah, I feel really lucky to have met Malcolm Wells and get his input as Recover evolved. Thank you guys so much for bearing with me on the lack of presentation that I was able to bring up myself, but I hope that was still helpful. There's a lot to go over with green roofs because they're non-native environments, because they're not on the, they're not at ground level or on the earth, and that they're often they're not the primary concern sometimes for the people who are in charge of a building project. And that's at times challenging, but it's also why we need more green roof specialty companies instead of large roofing companies or large landscaping companies that have less vested interest in the outcome of that particular roof.
That's cool. Thank you so much, Brendan. We do have some questions that I'll run through. I think I know the answer to this, but do green roofs impact the energy efficiency of their buildings?
Yes. So they don't keep buildings necessarily warmer, but they keep buildings much cooler. So they're reducing the cooling load of a building typically, but they're not providing much of a warming benefit to a building because it's a large wet mass on the roof.
Cool. Also, do you feel like the burgeoning interest in rooftop solar is having an adverse impact on the use of new green roof projects, or are there examples where both can cohabitate the space equally? Because I know they both take up a lot of square footage.
I'm sorry, did you, in terms of solar and green?
Yeah, so like
solar,
yeah, versus green roof, and how like a lot more people are doing solar on the roof, and that's taking up space, vice versa. Like,
so this is another area where ideally we follow Europe. Europe's done a really good job of doing green roofs and solar together, and they have a lot of like the ballasting systems, and we're starting to get those imported here and ideally even made here. But the ballasting systems for green roofs are for solar panels can be the green roof, and similarly, a solar panel is going to be much more efficient when the temperature of that solar panel is below, I think, like 100 degrees. So we're finding in really warm areas or places that have hot summers that solar panels can be 20 to 30% more efficient when they're not so hot. So a solar panel on an exposed roof is just going to be 30 degrees warmer than a solar panel on a green roof. And so the cooler solar panel is more effective. And similarly, you get benefit to the green roof and that you're keeping that there's shade areas and you're creating a little bit more of a diverse space on a roof by creating the shade and sun. And so there's not a lot of examples in the US of this, but it's coming. And yeah, so it is something we'll see more of.
awesome. I think there were some observations about the High Line, the New York City High Line. Do you feel like that's basically a large green roof planting?
Yeah, definitely. And what's great is it's raising awareness of what's possible. I love the High Line. I haven't been there in a number of years, but it's inspiring both in that their plant selection was amazing and interesting, and also it's hopefully inspiring builders, designers, and developers more innovative use of buildings.
Very cool. And then of course, like I have the same thought too, is I wish there was a place to nominate prospective green roof situations, because I think we all experience it where we're on the highway and we drive by and we see this massive black mat of tar or rubber. Do you know of such an outlet to nominate?
I don't. I would love that. I think, yeah, in the early years, we were at times trying to approach building owners, and it's tough because existing buildings can be a challenging place to install a green roof if the waterproofing is more than just a couple years old because of the potential for damage to an exposed roof. But there are a lot of GIS projects I've seen that involve mapping the potential for green roofs on cities and widespread application of them, and what the benefits would be for a local climate.
Very cool. Well, unless there's any other questions, I guess we'll thank you one more time, Brendan, for joining us today and sharing your rooftop experience and extensive knowledge on it. For me, it was really helpful to learn about the maintenance and the drainage setups and stuff like that. I wasn't aware of some of those options, so that was very cool. I think, yeah, that's it. Awesome. Great. Thank you so much, Brendan. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Hopefully the start of a little bit of a change for the ecological plant symposium. And we'll see you all soon and hopefully in person next year.